Going live. Alright, we'll start in just a sec. People are filtering in, but... Is everyone ready to get started?
Sure.
You'll be eating after during this?
I will. I've always been as disorganized as this.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get started. Welcome everyone joining us in Australia and around the world, both in person and online, to this public panel on the topic of the legacy of 1968, hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society in the Melbourne chapter. My name is Ryan Mickler and I'll be the moderator for this event. This is the 5th Platypus panel ever hosted in Melbourne on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and we thank all our audience members for being here in attendance. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006 in Chicago, organises reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old left of the 1920s and 1930s, the new left of the 1960s and 1970s, and the post-political left of the 1980s and 90s, all for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. You can learn more about our activities on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter through @PlatypusMelbourne or by visiting our website www.platypus1917.org. We also have a podcast titled Shit Platypus Says, which can be streamed on SoundCloud, and a monthly international open access publication called the Platypus Review, and you can find plenty of free copies at the back. Platypus Melbourne also runs a reading group where we go through a yearly syllabus from Rousseau to Marx to Lenin to Adorno, trying to understand what Marxism was. This primary reading group starts again in August, and everyone's invited to join us. There's 2 streams currently running of this reading group. One stream meets in person, led by myself, on Thursdays at the Clyde Hotel in Carlton, at the Kathleen Syme Library in Carlton, and the other one led by Johnny on Wednesday nights on Zoom for Australia-wide participation. Currently, during the winter break, we are running an in-person short reading group on the legacy of the Black question from 1776 to Black Lives Matter, meeting on Thursdays at the Kathleen Syme Library, and an online reading group hosted by Johnny on Marxism and politics, meeting on Wednesdays. The panel topic for today is the legacy of 1968, and the panellists have been asked to respond to the following prompt. The 1960s were a period of social upheaval that spanned the entire globe. The new left that emerged reached for Marxism to help navigate the politics of this decade. Platypus asks, how was this Marxism inherited and transformed? Did it succeed, or did it discover new problems? Today, with activists fighting in the streets and calling for liberation along the lines of race, gender and sexuality, the left's every attempt to discover new methods and new ideas seems to invoke memory of the political horizons of the new left. We can perhaps more than ever feel the urgency of the question, what lessons are to be drawn from the new left as another generation undertakes the project of building a left for the 21st century? To really hone in on this radical period, we asked the panellists to consider the following questions. How were you and your generation aware that what you were doing was something new compared to that of the old left of the 30s and 40s? How was this task transmitted and transformed? Which forms of theory and practice did you reach for in this period of upheaval, and why? Did the following decades vindicate your choices, or were you proven to be mistaken? How are today's left still tasked by the unfinished work, or the new work, handed on by the new left? Does the task of social emancipation today appear more or less obscure than it did in the 1960s and 70s? Our format is simple. Each of the 4 speakers will have around 12 to 15 minutes each for opening remarks, and then 5 to 7 minutes each after everyone has spoken to respond to fellow panellists before an hour or so of audience question and answer. If time permits, we'll also take questions from the online audience. For the Q&A, I hope to call on only questions. If you in the audience have more of a statement or a comment, I encourage you to work it into a short piece of writing and submit it to the Platypus Review, where the transcript from this event will publish along with some selected responses. Our speakers for today read out an agreed upon speaking order. Andy Blunden was the first conscript in Melbourne to burn his draft card, but fled the country and spent most of the next 20 years in the UK. Andy was either ignorant or contemptuous of all the Marxist groupings of the time, but by 1973 he was eventually recruited into Jerry Healey's Workers' Revolutionary Party. After 12 years as a loyal branch member of the WRP in East London, he participated in the expulsion of Healey and returned to Melbourne. As the Soviet bloc began to fall apart, he began a thoroughgoing re-examination of Marx and his legacy, which continues to this day. Alison Thorne, who is speaking on behalf of the Freedom Socialist Party, is the Melbourne branch organiser and managing editor of the Freedom Socialist Organiser. Alison is a member of Radical Women, having founded the Melbourne chapter in 1983. She is a queer liberationist, leads the FSP's work in the Aboriginal movement, and is a veteran public sector unionist. Arthur Dent is an unreconstructed Marxist, meaning unrepentantly old-fashioned, in the Maoist tradition. He was a prominent student activist at Monash during the Vietnam War years and a former member of the Communist Party of Australia, Marxist-Leninist. He founded the Red Eureka Movement in the late 1970s and today is a contributor at c21stleft.com. The event will conclude in under 3 hours before 4 p.m, at which point you're invited to join us across the road at the curtain to continue the discussions. With that, I hand it over to Andy, who will begin his opening remarks. Andy.
I've written down a few remarks to get us started. When I received my draft card in 1965, Sir Robert Gordon Menzies had won the previous 7 federal elections. After I left Australia, his successors would go on to win elections in 1966 and 1969. The right-wing Labor leader Gough Whitlam briefly interrupted LNP rule in 1972 until Hawke's election in 1983. In France, on March the 15th, 1968, an article in Le Monde claimed, "What currently characterises our public life is boredom. The French don't participate in any way in the great convulsions shaking the world." Clashes between students and police broke out a mere 5 days later. But on the whole, no one was really trying for social revolution in Paris in '68, and de Gaulle and his successors held power until Mitterrand's election in 1981. The 1980s in turn began the era of neoliberalism led by Thatcher and Reagan, but represented by Hawke and Keating in Australia. If '68 was meant to bring about socialism, then it patently failed. It was a cultural revolution. Changes in the labour process that it reflected were just beginning to show in 1968 and have now done their work. At root, the uprisings in '68 reflected changes which were taking place in the labour process, which would continue to generate cultural change for the following 50 years and more, but it never threatened the rule of capital. University attendance doubled in 7 years from 1956 to 1963 and doubled again during the following 7 years, all under conservative governments. Workers at Renault in France saw their future managers in the students throwing cobblestones in Rue Saint-Jacques. The changes which emerged in 1968 are fully developed in today's society, and as Marx put it, the hand of man is the key to the anatomy of the ape. 1968 was different in different countries. In January, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam marked the beginning of the end of the US occupation, while in Poland, workers went into universities and beat up protesting students. In April, Martin Luther King was assassinated in the US. In May, uprisings in France were led by students alongside a separate general strike of the industrial workers. In August, the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia, and Eurocommunism arose as the CPs turned their backs on the Soviet Union. The word sexism was invented in 1968, and anti-war protests and student occupations spread across the UK and USA, and students battled police in Japan and Germany. All this took place in a binary world, but how you saw that binary differed. For those Australians who became Marxists, including the Trotskyists and the Maoists, this binary was reflected in geopolitics. For the hippies and dropouts, the binary was a cultural one. Both of these stances have left their legacy for the present moment. On the one hand, the old Marxists who never noticed that the Cold War ended in 1991 and we lost. On the other hand, the old hippies who still can't tell the difference between Agent Orange and AstraZeneca. I hasten to add that binary and multiplicity are by no means mutually exclusive categories. Multiplicity both deploys and obscures the underlying binary. The issue is always to see both simultaneously. The fragmentation of classes did not mean that the struggle of labour and capital has disappeared, but nor are cultural struggles merely mediated cultural struggles. The crisis of the Fordist world produced genuine mass movements. Union memberships, which have been declining, actually grew in the decade following 1968. These were mass movements with a majoritarian consciousness, although they always remained a minority, and in fact drew the energy from that minority position. No one who has experienced those mass movements can ever be the same again, while neoliberalism, which arrived in the 1980s, made such movements nearly impossible. The new relation of class forces produced by the postmodern labour process, which has given us a post-industrial working class, makes the tasks in front of revolutionaries much more complicated. Looking back on 68, it was a simpler world, and it does seem as if we all had a very simplistic view of the world, an outlook which corresponded to mass movements. Now, as to Platypus's questions, how was the Marxism of the 50s and 60s inherited and transformed? I answer that Marxism has been transformed in exactly the same way that the working class, the social base of Marxism, has been transformed in the same period. What lessons are to be drawn from the new left as another generation undertakes the building of a left for the 21st century? We have to purge the left of the illusions of 1968. The binary conceptions rooted in industrial capitalism and the Cold War have to be dispelled while preserving and realising the vision of a mass movement from that period and earlier. How were you aware that you were doing something new compared to the old left, and how was this task transmitted and understood? In my view, as a 20-something, quite unfairly I now think, the entire left was implicated in the despicable system which I rejected in toto. When the upsurges of 1968 came though, I did feel part of something larger, but whatever it was somewhat surreal in my mind. Which forms of theory and practice did you reach for in this period, and why? Well, I embraced the Marxism of Marx and Engels in 1968, but I never figured out a viable practice to express my rejectionism. I didn't join anything. I knew that protest politics would not simply turn into revolutionary politics. I thought that party building was a rotten compromise unless it was serious preparation for revolution. I was just smart enough, fortunately, to reject terrorism and the self-isolation that entailed. Did the following decades vindicate your choices, or were you proven to be mistaken? I was recruited by the Trotskyists in 1973, as Ryan has outlined, but by the 1990s I was convinced of the futility and arrogance of Trotskyist party building. The Marxist parties have a role to play, but the major task is building the solidarity of the working class. How are today's left tasked by the unfinished work, or the new work handed on by the new left? The unfinished work is to learn how to practice solidarity. After all these years, we still haven't learned. Marxists still say, follow us. The revolution is so much bigger than any party. Does the task of social emancipation appear more or less obscure than it did in the 60s and 70s? I think social emancipation now looks more realistic than it did in 1968, but it looks much more like a long-term project. because nothing about the status quo looks stable, and all the alternative futures look even worse. No one can envisage a peaceful or prosperous future. In fact, it's hard to imagine any future at all. So the key question is, while recognising that the industrial working class is gone, we have a postmodern, fragmented working class. There's no revolution without a mass movement. I often think, next time you're in a plane coming into Melbourne, you can go under the cloud cover, and then you can see stretched before your eyes, as far as the eye can see, these roofs, each of them with a little group of people under them. As far as the eyes can see, and think of the tasks of making revolution. I think in 1968, there was things were hopping under all those roofs, right? Until you get that, you've got no revolution. So we all have work to do, and the question is how the work each of us chooses to do can mesh together in order to produce a mass movement. That's all.
Thank you, Andy. Alison.
Okay, well, thank you, very interesting. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri Willem clan of the Kulin Nation, and that sovereignty has never been ceded. As a Marxist feminist, a more active stance than respect is required. I pledge my solidarity to stand shoulder to shoulder with both elders and young warriors in the fight against First Nations oppression. One of the enduring legacies of the era that we're discussing is a deeper appreciation, courtesy of the Tent Embassy and the movement it sparked, that to truly liberate First Nations is a revolutionary question. Capitalism in Australia was built on lands stolen from First Nations, coupled with the exploitation of the labour of First Peoples and the working class. The Platypus prompt asks how the Marxism inherited by 60s activists was transformed by this era. And I contend that today there is a deeper appreciation that questions of race, gender, sexuality and nationality can no longer be dismissed as secondary questions, but as central to the class struggle. Women, people of colour, queer people are the majority of the working class, and an increasingly assertive majority at that. Unlike the other panellists, I was not politically active in 1968, but the Freedom Socialist Party was formed during this dynamic era and is still going strong today. The founders of FSP were pioneers, emerging from the old left and diving into the struggles that radicalised a generation. In Socialist Feminism and the Revolutionary Party, FSP leader Andrea Bauer writes, "Nothing can show more clearly than James P. Cannon's statement that the program creates the organisation than the founding of the FSP, which emerged from the Socialist Workers' Party in 1966, because the FSP's political orientation was better grounded in the changing times. The SWP, which led union struggles during the heydays of the 30s and the 40s, had ossified by the 60s. The McCarthy era took its toll when a wave of anti-communism swept the unions. The SWP became isolated and stuck in what we call radical labourism. This was an orientation to the more privileged workers and to the increasingly conservative union bureaucracy. What the SWP failed to appreciate was the dynamism being shown by the most oppressed sectors of the working class. For more than a decade, FSP's founders organised as a tendency inside the SWP, objectively analysing the working class, developing groundbreaking theory on both race and sex, and seeking to reorient the party. And when this failed, they were forced out and formed a new party. Central to the theory of this new party was revolutionary integration, which explores the interdependence of black liberation and working class emancipation in the US, and explains why the leadership of black workers is absolutely crucial for the whole working class. The logic of black struggle is also inherently revolutionary because capitalism depends on racism to survive. The movement must become revolutionary if it's to win a better day for African Americans. But in contrast, the SWP leadership oriented the party to trailing after black nationalism. This when African Americans are not an oppressed nation, but a super exploited race. Revolutionary integration explains, for an oppressed nation to become integrated is a reactionary concession to the status quo, a defeat. Integration for blacks is revolutionary because American capitalism incorporates segregation in its fundamental structure and cannot survive without it. In contrast, Native Americans and the indigenous people of this continent are oppressed nations, and demands which challenge assimilation and forcible integration, such as land rights and maintenance of language, are crucial to support. The founders of FSP also recognised the explosive power of the fight for women's liberation and had long been pushing the SWP to take this seriously. In the FSP's founding document, Why We Left the SWP, the key programmatic differences are explained, including our revolutionary feminism. The FSP boldly declared, "We place the struggle for women's emancipation on the level of a first-class theoretical and programmatic question," adding, as the first tendency in the history of American radicalism to formally incorporate this question into our basic program, "We proclaim our resistance to the creeping paralysis of male supremacy, which by now had become an ingrained practice in the entire labour and socialist movement and a growing danger to the civil rights movement. The leading role of women in the fight for civil rights, in the anti-war movement, in the civil liberties campaigns, etc., it's not accidental, but results from the special dynamic developed by women as an oppressed sex, seeking liberation for themselves and for all other victims of discrimination. We say Marxism should not be treated as a dogma, but a method to be applied to changing times. And the creation of FSP as the first socialist feminist party in history is a testament to this approach. Marxist feminism is an expansion of the revolutionary arsenal of Marxism. It builds on the thinking of early socialist leaders about both class exploitation and women's subordination. Having been founded on a program which oriented to the dynamism and leadership of women and people of colour, the new party dived headlong into the upheavals of the 60s. The FSP collaborated closely with the Black Panther Party and in 1969 was part of an armed defence guard for the party. It embraced gay liberation, an upsurge that rippled across the globe. Gay liberation was supercharged by the Stonewall riots, which were led by working class trans women of colour, butch dykes, and an assortment of working class queer rebels. Part of the party's founding program was a call to intervene with serious politics in the anti-war movement. It was clear that the capitalist class had a fundamental stake in the war, profiting from it richly. The FSP advocated independent anti-capitalist politics that connected the war to the other evils of the system. As well as adopting a multi-issue approach, FSP thought it crucial to be open socialists in the movement, to educate about imperialism and that capitalism breeds war. The party also fought for Black, Chicano and women's voices to be heard in the movement. While the politics of the era was given the name New Left, FSP women found that in many respects the New Left was little different from the old. Gloria Martin, a mother of 8, became an FSP leader. She joined the Communist Party as a young worker, where she was told, "Stop challenging your subordination." CP leaders warned her, "Enough said, you will get your freedom after the revolution. The woman question, you know, is a secondary question," Gloria was told. The plain-speaking Martin, who went on to become party organiser and wrote Socialist Feminism the first decade, 66 to 76, penned an important piece titled "Where Matters Stand With Me." She reflected, and then the civil rights movement, sparked by black seamstress Rosa Parks in 1955, exploded. Opposition to the Vietnam War brought thousands onto the streets, and young women, tired of their helpmate position in the movement, began to notice that things were no different in the New Left than they were in the old. She describes how women, fed up with sexism in the movement, formed women's caucuses to fight the male chauvinist leaders of the New Left. In 1967, FSP founder Clara Fraser, Martin and other party women came together with women from the New Left Students for a Democratic Society and founded Radical Women, an autonomous Marxist feminist women's leadership organisation. Now, it's very important to distinguish between autonomy and separatism, both of which became popular in the 60s. Autonomy is about who is working together, but separatism is about a political program based on separating one's interests from the rest of the working class, an approach which is a reactionary dead end. Radical Women was founded as an autonomous organisation of women who organised around a distinct Marxist feminist program that is anything other than separatist. Writing in Decade, Martin says, "Life proved that women would flourish amidst the special experience, novel climate and intensive training available in an all-women's group. The program and practice of Radical Women have addressed the position that women under capitalism and raised the consciousness of hundreds. A socialist feminist mass organisation like Radical Women has been unique, encouraging women to function as a vanguard and train themselves for leadership. Radical Women continues to thrive and today is an organisation for women, both cis and trans, and for non-binary people. Autonomous organising was crucial to building revolutionary women's leadership because male chauvinism was so entrenched in the left, both old and new. And my own personal experience of politicisation also vindicates the validity of autonomous organising. Having come out as queer, I was drawn to gay liberation, and this rapidly led me to Marxist feminism. As immersed in the autonomous gay movement, I grappled with the links between homosexual oppression and women's oppression, discovering the source of both to be private property. Now, Platypus has posed some interesting questions. On the question of newness, the explicit Marxist feminist organising by both FSP and Radical Women was very new. This politics drew from the best of both the old left and the new left to create something distinct. The party had strong women leaders, and at one point in its early history, after male leaders failed to walk their talk, for a brief period the party was all women. The question of unfinished work is a vital one. 1968 stood out as a year of global upheaval in a turbulent era. Masses of working class people were mobilising against the war and fighting for their liberation. There were genuine revolutionary opportunities, not least the mass strikes and uprisings in France in 1968, which were sabotaged by the duplicitous role of the Communist Party. The period was tumultuous here in Australia too. The 7-year Gurindji walk-off, which began in 1966, was in full flight. A near-general strike effectively challenged the penal powers and saw Clary O'Shea released. The anti-war movement was building momentum, and Australian women were in revolt, with iconic protests such as the 1965 action by 3 Brisbane women angered at their exclusion from public bars, a symbol of sexist exclusion from public life. Now, just last month, a statue was unveiled outside this very building, immortalising Zelda D'Aprano, who in 1969 chained herself to the door of the Commonwealth Arbitration Commission to protest women's lack of equal pay. More than half a century later, equal pay has still not been achieved, with women earning 87 cents for every dollar earned by men. Equal pay is still elusive because patriarchy, like racism, is one of the cornerstones of capitalism, and capitalism is still very much with us. The global youth uprising of the 60s was deeply anti-capitalist, with a generation passionately desiring to bust out of the deadening conformity and alienation that Marx wrote about. But these masses did not topple capitalism. A revolution requires the right objective conditions coupled with a leadership that has the perspective of taking power. While there were a number of small groups, amongst them the FSP, which had this perspective of building an organisation that could do this, a mass revolutionary party did not exist. The FSP argues that it's essential to forge a revolutionary vanguard in order to be ready when a revolutionary upsurge occurs. Revolution requires preparation, and this involves forging a tested leadership and program that comes through clarifying ideas. A vanguard party synthesises and learns the lessons of history. Time and again, we see that without a revolutionary party, opportunities created by revolutionary upheavals will subside without the working class taking power. A recent example, of course, is the Arab Spring. Revolutionary recruitment is also important. Dynamic periods in history offer a rich opportunity for serious radicals to undertake the kind of comradely dialogue and probing discussion that can lead to a structural recruitment of uncompromising Marxists in a new and more powerful vanguard party. Today, the FSP is part of an international recruitment project called Committee for Revolutionary International Recruitment. And through CRIR, we're working with revolutionary parties from Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, as well as our section in the US, and all share our internationalist socialist feminism. In our 1999 political resolution, From the Ashes of the Old Century, A Better World's in Birth, we explain what happened to the militancy of the 60s and 70s, pinning the blame for the relative conservatism of movements on the failure of the 60s era movement to go beyond militancy to insurrection. We explain how the rebels were tamed. By the end of the Vietnam War, many movement leaders had either been bought off via government careers or killed off by the police. This generation won genuine reforms, something that is much more difficult today under late capitalism. In the post-war era, capitalism could afford to provide concessions to sections of the working class in advanced capitalist countries. And they did this to try to keep the peace. The irony is that winning a seat at the table and funding for services, for example, the women's refuge movement, co-opted leaders, changing their relationship to the struggle as radical grassroots groups became professionalised NGOs that are so prevalent today. At the source of all the problems the 60s generation were fighting against, and those which plague young people today, is private property. As the world becomes more unequal, the climate warms, inter-imperialist rivalries heat up, and right-wing populism is getting a hearing, finishing the task of getting rid of capitalism is ever more urgent. The choice posed by Rosa Luxemburg of socialism or barbarism is stark. Our perspective developed when the FSP was formed in the 60s, of forging united fronts, bringing together working class forces with disparate views in action to defend the class, while seeking to build a mass revolutionary party with a perspective of taking power. And we believe that perspective has never been more correct. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison.
Arthur, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, first, apologies. I've been disorganised all my life. I had plenty of opportunity to prepare a draft, and I didn't. I've just got notes, but the title tells you the content. If you thought the pseudo-left has a legacy from the 60s, you weren't there. And I'm delighted to discover that Andy Blunden was there, because I don't think he would sharply disagree with my position that the pseudo-left that we have now does not have a legacy from the 60s. At any rate, he's described accurately that there was, in Australia, we had the Menzies era. It was the most conservative period during the Cold War, and it lasted right through the Vietnam War. And we had a radical mass movement, which was global, it was worldwide, it was militant, it caused a lot of trouble, and it led to a lot of social change. Now, I have a less pessimistic view about defeat and the social change. To me, a major reason why the radical left that grew up in the 60s movement faded out of existence, basically in the early 70s, but certainly that was complete by the end of the 70s, was that the basic demands of the mass movement had been accommodated by a major retreat by the system. There was a massive cultural revolt, a generational change, and they stopped telling people how they should cut their hair short and dress properly and so on. There was a war in Vietnam, and they lost. And we were celebrating the victory. But actually, they were quite cunning about that. We didn't get to hold proper victory celebrations because they, I recall quite vividly that they signed the Paris peace agreements a couple of weeks after the December bombing, Christmas bombing of Hanoi. And I did win a bet with the Trotskyists then, and it was, I think, Lynn Beaton's husband, Jerry, that he was quite confident that these negotiations in Paris were going nowhere, and the proof of that was in the bombing of Hanoi, which was quite dramatic. And I'd noticed in the papers that buried on the front page, but as a tiny paragraph, was that Nixon was bombing Hanoi was the big headline, and the tiny paragraph was that they cut off all funds from the puppet government in South Vietnam until it signed the agreement. So my view was that they were on the verge of signing the agreement within a few weeks, and they did. It was signed in January. But then they had this long pause, and by the time all the troops were out, they were leaving under Vietnamese supervision. Like there would be a Vietnamese Revolutionary Army officer at the ports counting them as they left and releasing American prisoners in proportion to the numbers that had left. But by the time they had fully left, they had their decent interval, and it wasn't news when South Vietnam collapsed, and it was a bit of news because they had the same clumsy evacuation that they had in Afghanistan. But there wasn't this sense of we won. There was just a sense of the war was over, and something else was happening to some other government that America wasn't actually involved in. So we didn't have that sensation of a movement that had won. But the realities were that the principal thing that drew people into the 60s mass movement, at least in America and Australia, because we were both participants in the war, was Vietnam, and we won. And on a lot of the other issues, society moved forward. And the thing that I don't like about both the other speakers is the mood of gloom and pessimism that is pervasive at the moment, right? That to me, we're headed for another period of upheaval. And I'm delighted to see that the so-called left, the pseudo-left, is pretty much on its last legs. This to me is a cause for joy. And I'll read you a quote from Arena magazine, which folded long ago, but I did write to it when they were pontificating about their experiences in the Maoists and so on. I said, while I agree that all four is better, I do not endorse the opinion that, quote, the conditions of the Australian left calls for wider discussion and debate and opening up of minds as well as ranks.
Can you turn the microphone?
Speaking
Yeah,
to the
sorry.
mic.
Yeah, bring them on.
Speak to the microphone in the paper section.
Yeah.
I do not agree that the condition of the Australian left calls for wider discussion and debate and opening up of minds as well as ranks. The condition of the Australian left calls for a decent burial with a critical stake through its heart, alongside its counterparts abroad. Then we shall see. Now that was in 1985. I think the Leatherdykes said it earlier. There's a nice piece by Gail Rubin in 1981 where she says, I did not join the women's movement to have my status depend on my ability to bear children. And she kept, I can't find the exact quote here, but there was a whole lot about, I didn't join the women's movement to be told how to be a good little girl. And I fear that the women's movement is repeating the worst errors of a century ago. The 19th century feminist movement began as a radical critique of women's role and status, but it became increasingly conservative and similarly shifted the burden of its argument onto a reconstituted femininity in the form of alleged female moral superiority. Much of the 19th century movement degenerated into a variety of morality crusades, with conservative feminists pursuing what they took to be a women's agenda in anti-prostitution, anti-masturbation, anti-obscenity and anti-vice campaigns. It will be an historical tragedy of almost unthinkable dimensions if the revived feminist movement dissipates into a series of campaigns against recreational sex, popular music and sexually explicit materials. But this appears to be the direction in which feminism is moving. And it did move in that direction for a while. It's moved in different directions since, but it's gone well away from the radical liberations movement that did grow up with the 60s left. And the 60s left radical liberation movement also disappeared. We did have contact with, like the 60s actually started earlier in America with the civil rights movement, and it retained a large component of radical action for democratic rights. But it wouldn't have occurred, and we did have freedom rides in Australia just before the Vietnam movement took off. I wasn't part of that, but I was Secretary of Youth Against Apartheid when I was 14, which would have been 1963 or something. And I was on the State Executive of Young Labour Association. When we did have at that time, I would have considered myself a hard left social democrat, and as a hard left social democrat, I had some familiarity with Marx. Socialism, Utopian and Scientific was the only publication that we actually produced in Australia during the 60s of the classics, because the Chinese foreign language press published practically everything else that Marxists should read. They didn't get around to this one until 1975, which was just before they got overthrown. But this is probably the most translated short summary of Marxism in the history of the movement. And pretty well everyone in the Second International that was serious would have been expected to be familiar with it. So I would recommend it to anyone here that hasn't, or to anyone here that has read it too. Start with the third section, which is only 10 pages and tells you, fundamental principles of historical materialism and the development of state capitalism, which is what Engels was expecting it to develop into and has. And the second one was explaining principles of, philosophical materialism generally. And the first one is simultaneously praising the utopian socialists who came before the Marxist movement and pointing out that they degenerated into doctrinaire sects, which of course is, we'd all be familiar with if we're aware of the continued existence of the civilized. On the Aboriginal movement here, we were in contact with some radical Aboriginal activists, but I never met anybody among radical Aborigines who wanted to pay tribute to their elders. It just wasn't a 60s thing to be paying tribute to one's elders. And it's not something that I can stomach and give credence to. When I read the Uluru Declaration and they say things like, we emerged from the soil and will return thither, and I don't know why they use the expression thither, but my picture of Aboriginals is that they're not part of the flora, let alone part of the fauna. They're not part of the fauna, they're not part of the flora, they're not vegetation. They didn't spring from the soil, they don't have a deep connection to land. If they did, they would need appropriate psychological treatment. They have problems of oppression and stuff that need to be dealt with in a modern society, and that they were fighting. There were Aboriginal activists who were fighting that way, and we're having imposed on us an absolutely alien, extreme right-wing ideology about respecting elders and treating Aborigines as some kind of museum piece. But anyway, that's by the way. I did start preparing notes, and I will finish them. You'll find them at 21st Century Left, which is spelled C21ST Left, all one word. So C21 is 21st Century with the stleft.com. It's a WordPress blog, and I put the headline there. So I'll start dealing with the specific topics that were raised for answers. I will also mention that I'll include as many links as I can. If people are into the history, this is a history of Melbourne Maoists, and I'll give the link to it. It's a reasonably objective account of what happened at one campus. We wrote a book, it's called Its Right to Rebel, and I'll start with the quote from Its Right to Rebel, because I believe that's the answer to the question of what the Marxism we were reaching towards was. And I'd like to stress again that it was a mass movement. The hippies were also part of it. They were more inclined towards turning on, tuning out, dropping out. So they certainly weren't reaching for Marxism. The pacifists were part of it. There were a lot of political trends in it, but the main trends that were reaching out for Marxism were in America and in Melbourne were overwhelmingly Maoist. The Trots were a very minor feature in both places. I believe they may have been more important in parts of Europe, but my impression is that it was also primarily Maoist in France and Germany. I don't know. They don't even speak English in those places, so I haven't studied them much. I did visit Portugal during a period immediately after the revolution there, and definitely it was a major struggle when people talk about organising a militant party determined to take power. Well, that was exactly what the Portuguese Communist Party was doing, and the Maoists were joining together with the Socialist Party to stop them. And some of the Maoist leaders ended up in the Socialist Party, and one of them became president of the European Union and so on. But basically, revolutionaries in Portugal did not want another Eastern European country in Western Europe. The revolution in the 60s was also directed against Soviet fascism. By 1969, we were calling it fascist. In 1968, I think we would have just been calling it imperialist, and even the CPA was basically agreeing with that. When they invaded Czechoslovakia, they opposed it. When they threatened China, when they sought agreement with the US as would you mind if we launched a preemptive nuclear strike against China, rather fortunately the Nixon administration said yes, we mind a lot, and put some of their nuclear forces on alert. So they never did launch a nuclear strike against China. But definitely Maoists were saying that they were a fascist regime pretty strongly from '69 onwards. And when they collapsed completely in 1991, we did not regard that as a defeat. And and it's certainly true that the switch over to sort of plain ordinary gangster kleptocracy that occurred since then, which has culminated in Putin, I'm looking forward to the total elimination of that regime, and I don't expect it to be a proletarian revolution. I think they're headed for an even more fascist regime in the near future. There's just, I don't know if you've seen the news today, there's an insurrection going on now from the mercenaries, and it's probably the FSB will take power. I don't know what will happen, but they can't rule for long, and that regime is bound to get overthrown, and it's bound to get some kind of modern bourgeois democracy as exists in the rest of Europe. And I'm in favour of that. It's a social advance for a country that backward, that they have an openly czarist and fascist autocracy that has invaded Ukraine. And of course, the pseudo-left here has great difficulty doing anything about it. So I would congratulate the Freedom Socialist Party has actually put out a better statement than any of the other, I can't help saying, any of the other pseudo-left groups. They actually did do quite explicitly say that Ukraine not only should be supported and that not only is Russia fascist, but they need arms and they're entitled to get them wherever they can. And it seems to me just an oddity that they throw in, and we've got to dismantle NATO. But I've got to tell you that that's a sign of the totally unrealistic disconnection between reality and sloganeering in political situations that is characteristic of the pseudo-left groups, which did exist in the 60s and didn't get any traction because that was the way they thought. You can't simultaneously call for arms for Ukraine and dismantle NATO. At the moment, the issue we should be calling for is that we could be, I can understand people from the 60s even more than people who arrived later had this hang-up about the US, that it was very difficult to imagine that any group that lives in the belly of the beast in the USA is going to support the US sending arms to Ukraine. They just have a hang-up about it the same way we encountered people who had a hang-up about the Soviet Union in the 1960s, and they thought German revanchism was the main danger to the world. But the current war that's going on in Europe right now is between Russian fascism and Ukraine. It's not a proxy war fought by the US, but the US is the arsenal. And we can, if you want to denounce the US, which I quite enjoy doing, there's plenty to denounce them for in their absolute failure to supply stuff from the arsenal that they keep boasting about. I mean, they sent 3,000 tanks to liberate the oil fields of Kuwait. They're sending 30 tanks to help Ukraine, and they'll be delivered towards the end of this year, right? There's a lot of people dying while fighting Ukrainian fascism, while the Western politicians are congratulating themselves for their heroic efforts. There should be a strong left campaign that is saying we want to end the war quickly. People have got to join in, send them all the arms they need, and whatever else they need. They may need some they may need some Air Force pilots if they haven't got time to train. But whatever it is, in the same way that we were in solidarity with Vietnam and kicking out the American imperialism, we have to be in active solidarity with Ukraine, and you can't mix that up with saying dismantle NATO, because you're not thinking straight when you do. So,
you have just about 2 or 3 minutes left.
Okay, so that was one of my 2 concrete proposals. The other concrete proposal is that there should be a study group on Maxikowski, and I'll explain what that's all about, but I'll just mention now that there is a capitalist crisis looming. I will confess that I've been saying that for about 4 decades now. and therefore I can't claim any credibility. But a lot more people are saying it now. It's hit the business pages. There's every reason to believe, and I don't think anyone could dispute, that neither the 60s left nor anything since has had the foggiest clue about economics, right? I can't imagine anyone claiming that they do. Right? We quite simply don't even bother taking part when they're discussing budgets and things like that. And occasionally you'll see some idiotic thing in a socialist newspaper or something. But fundamentally, Lenin was right when he said that none of the Second International leaders could understand capital. They couldn't get past the first 3 chapters. And as Andy Blunden mentioned in his recent paper, you've got to have a bit of dialectics to understand the first 3 chapters. And I recommend the first 10 pages of that paper. So I'll put links about that in the thing. I'll just conclude with what I was going to start with, that the Marxism we reached out for, I'm from the old left. It was the Marxism that was summarised like this. Marxism consists of thousands of truths, but they all boil down into one sentence. It is right to rebel. For thousands of years, it had been said it was right to oppress, it was right to exploit, and it was wrong to rebel. This old verdict was only reversed with the appearance of Marxism. This is a great contribution. It was through struggle that the proletariat learned this truth, and Marx drew the conclusion. And from this truth, there follows resistance, struggle, the fight for socialism. Now, a critical thing that the Chinese contributed to the 60s movement was that break with the defeat of the Russian Revolution. Another quote from Mao that I'll put up on the website was that it was through the Russians that the Chinese got to hear about Marxism. And it was pretty much through the Cultural Revolution in China that the mass movement in the West got to hear about Marxism and Maoism. We were stuck with an absolutely conservative reactionary Soviet Union for a couple of decades before it became openly fascist, right? But while there were still some pseudo-left groups, and there were Trots were all talking about it being a workers' state and arguing about whether it was a workers' state or state capitalist or whatever. But nobody, even mildly progressive, could be even slightly attracted towards the Brezhnev regime in its years of stagnation, right? But we were stuck with the fact that it was a living proof of what the Cold War had been emphasising throughout, that capitalism was vastly superior to socialism and that it had better living standards under capitalism. It was a living proof that the anarchists were right and that the Marxists were hopeless. And it was a living proof that the Social Democrats were right and the Marxists were hopeless. And it was a living proof that the Trots were right and the Stalinists were hopeless. Right? So we were stuck with that until the salvos of the Cultural Revolution brought us some Marxism, because they were saying there is a way around the problem of the degeneration of revolutions. And the answer they came up with was, of course, permanent revolution, a concept that Trotsky's completely obscure, but the way that we had to avoid the term permanent revolution because the Trots had a trademark on it, so we called it uninterrupted revolution. But I prefer the original version from Marx. Mao talked about it that Lenin spoke of building a bourgeois state without capitalists to safeguard bourgeois right. We ourselves have built just such a state, not much different from the old society. There are ranks and grades, 8 grades of wages, distribution according to work, and exchange of equal values. You're making the socialist revolution and yet don't know where the bourgeoisie is. It is right in the Communist Party. Those in power taking the capitalist road. The capitalist roaders are still on the capitalist road. Where in the Communist Party was the leadership of the bourgeoisie? In the top leadership of the Communist Party.
You wrap up, Arthur.
Will there be a need for revolution 100 years from now? Will there still be a need for revolution 1,000 years from now? There is always a need for revolution. There are always sections of the people who feel themselves oppressed. Junior officials, students, workers, peasants and soldiers don't like big shots oppressing them. That's why they want revolution. Will contradictions no longer be seen 10,000 years from now? Why not? They will be seen. And I will finally conclude with the last words of the Communist Manifesto. In short, the Communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the social and political order of things. In all these movements, they bring to the front as the leading question in each the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. Finally, they labour everywhere for the union and agreement of the democratic parties in all countries. The Communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of all countries unite. And if you look at the preface to it, it explains why it wasn't called a socialist manifesto. Socialism was bourgeois in 1847.
Okay, thank you, Arthur. Okay, I'll just say a few things to potentially tie together a few of those points before we turn back to the panelists for their responses. I think you all touched on the sort of relations between the Vanguard Party, especially as Alison brought it up, but the relation of the Vanguard Party to the new social movements of the 1960s. And there seemed at times to be sort of tensions between these sort of proclamations of the role of the Vanguard Party leading the proletariat as it was in the October Revolution, and this sort of from below character that the 1960s had. So how would your understanding of Marxism sort of explain that tension between the party and the mass movements of the 1960s, but also allow yourself to respond to each of the other panels? Andy.
Okay, I'll respond. Look, Alison's a great organiser and so on, but the theory behind that you're building a party ready to take over when the opportunity comes. I mean, my God, could socialism arrive in such a way? You know, as I said, the conclusion I drew from my 20-odd years as a Trotskyist is this is arrogant, mistaken, reactionary, and just illusory. That's why I ask people to imagine the sight of a city of 6 million people, never mind 6 billion people on Earth. And you think that you can organise a little group that's going to step in, you know, it's all ready to go, you know, and lead that. Now, we all have work to do, depending on your particular location in society, the particular contradictions, your own personal contribution that you can make. I agree with Arthur's slogan, it is right to rebel, whether you're a lawyer, a teacher, a factory worker, whatever, there is a way of being a communist in that position. And the two things you have to do, one is to fight, which is more an ethical question of how to be a communist in this period. And the other role is to learn how to solidarize, right? Because the revolution doesn't happen because it's being directed by a party or something. Revolution only happens by dispensing with all that. If there's people come together, they do so voluntarily. If people are going to submit themselves to a common code and vision, they come to it voluntarily by their own way, you know. And I'm really fed up after decades of follow us, we're the revolutionary party. No, I am. And yet many friends I know who don't belong to any party, but believe in the party. And I say, yeah, mate, but which party do you belong to? I don't belong to any. Why not? Well, none of the parties seem to be, up to it, right? So if after all these years of trying to build a party, the mass result is people that have left the party, learn some lessons from that. Learn some lessons, right? And then you have the party that, if it actually succeeds in seizing power, who the hell wants to seize power? The purpose is to overthrow that power. The only party that's seizing power is the combined masses of millions, right? If the party seizes power, well, then what you have is exhibited in what degenerated into Brezhnev in the end, right? So, look, it's learn how to foster and develop solidarity. That is to say, learning to, and I mean, you do that very well, quite honestly, as an activist capable of exercising solidarity. I wouldn't criticise you, right? But that is the vision that has to be extended towards making revolutions, not something else. You can't just do solidarity in day-to-day work and then say, oh, it's all for the day I'll take over because I've got my party all ready to go, and when the masses call out for it, you know, we'll throw it in. No, please. If the masses aren't following a party now, I mean, even leaving the what we had, the centrist parties, right? I mean, the party organisation belongs to a past period, just the same as capitalists now use franchising and outsourcing because it's a more effective way of organising and accumulating capital. The left also has to understand that franchising and outsourcing is a much more effective way of organising for revolution. To think that you're going to build an old style, you know, Henry Ford type company for revolution, that was out of date 100 years ago. Fordism in politics is just as out of date as it is in accumulating capital.
Alison, you like to
Just a question, Ryan.
Yes.
Am I to respond to all the things that all the speakers said?
as you see fit.
just like as I see fit?
As you see fit.
Okay,
You're happy
all
to
right.
have the floor.
Okay, well, look, I will start by responding to what Andy has just said, and I think there's a real misunderstanding of the question of the Vanguard Party. The Freedom Socialist Party does not say, you know, like as we exist right now, you know, that we are a vanguard party, you know, like capable of making an insurrection. However, we have that orientation, and importantly, we have a perspective of both regroupment, revolutionary regroupment, and the question of united fronts. And united fronts are critically important because they are a way of bringing together disparate working class forces in a democratic way to unite around a key set of demands and to fight in the interests of the class. You know, and this is something, you know, that we argue for, that we not only argue for, that we do in terms of working with others. So, like Andy says, that to seize power, you know, like it will take the combined masses of millions. I don't disagree. The Freedom Socialist Party, you know, does not disagree with that. The question is, how are we going to get there, and how are we actually going to achieve that? Because as Arthur talked about, like Arthur said, it's right to rebel. What is the goal of rebellion? What are the demands that we're actually fighting for? What are the goals? Like in Andy's opening statement, like it was quite pessimistic, like in terms of talking about the period that we're in now. In the Freedom Socialist Party, we are optimists, and we're optimists because of our Marxism. And we say to those, who are pessimistic in the 21st century, to become optimists, you need to look in the right, you need to be looking in the right place. One of the things that, has really inspired us this year is the Transgender Day of Visibility rally that was held on March 31st this year. It was incredible. 5,000 people out on the streets, mostly young trans people and trade unionists, many, union flags, who were responding to Posey Parker visiting Australia and Nazis, parading on the steps of Parliament House, and it was like a very, very militant rally. And go look in those places, and people will feel much more optimistic. Arthur talked about the women's movement and said that the women's movement is repeating the worst errors of of Puritanism, basically.
That was the Gail Rubin.
Gail Rubin, yes, but you were quoting Gail Rubin, and you were quoting it approvingly. And what we would say is, surely those of us who are here at an event like this, we're Marxists. We need to be more dialectical in our thinking. Feminism is not a monolithic block. It's not a monolithic blob. There's liberal feminism, bourgeois feminism. There's radical feminism that see men as the enemy. And then there's Marxist feminism, which is intersectional and looks at the connections between patriarchy and class. We can say the same, like when we look at the Aboriginal movement. There's a conservative, bureaucratised middle caste layer, and then there's the radical, grassroots of the movement, the black matriarchy, incredibly powerful. I might just stop there and let Arthur have a go, although there's many more things to respond to.
Yes, Arthur, please.
Well, I'm assuming there's going to be a long discussion.
Oh, please. We'll have another round as well after. Yeah.
Right.
Please go.
Yep. So, on Andy's point about the Vanguard Party, I can't resist. Definitely, I don't believe that the Leatherdykes writing Coming to Power were suggesting that the women's movement was a united bloc with no varying positions. The lesbian SM people were definitely a varying position in a full galaxy of positions. That I was mentioning that they were nailing the fact that a conscious push had been made to make the women's movement, that was a powerful liberation type struggle, make it into a conservative movement. And the same thing happened to the left more generally, and I think I was struck by them not only out of prurient interest, but because they were one of the earlier ones to be drawing attention to this fact that what people regard as the left today was actually quite reactionary and conservative. Now, returning to on the question that Alison also raised about, well, it's all very well rebelling, but what's your program? What are you rebelling for? I think that was a key weakness, but it was made. It was the same weakness as not having an economic program, because it was nonsense to be saying that we're going to overthrow imperialism and establish a revolutionary insurrection if you have no idea how you're going to reorganise the economy. But at the same time, we were following the program that had been inherited from the 19th century, which was succinctly stated in the Civil War in France. This socialism that was in opposition to the doctrinaire, utopian doctrinaire socialism of the sect, this socialism is the declaration of this was revolutionary socialism, is the declaration of the permanence of the revolution. The class dictatorship of the proletariat as the necessary transit point to the abolition of class distinctions generally, to the abolition of all the relations of production on which they rest, to the abolition of all the social relations that correspond to these relations of production, to the revolutionising of all the ideas that result from these social relations. Now, that's a fairly comprehensive program. It needs to be spelled out a little bit for any particular decade of mass movement that you happen to be living in. But as far as talking about what Marxism's program is, that's the program. We're out for the lot, right? Now, as far as returning to Andy's question about the Vanguard Party, I agree with the substance of his comments, but with a twist. That was the party program at Monash, right? We had the most radical campus in Australia. We had the largest mass movement, and the way we organised was very much on that franchise basis. That it was a mass movement that we were helping to organise, but we did help. We weren't in the way telling them. I would rephrase the slogan of "Join us." The actual appeal of the various Vanguard parties was "Join us and you need never think again." The entire purpose of forming communist organisations within the mass movement was to have inter-party struggle, right? That you would have continuous debate about strategy and tactics, and you would be encouraging that debate wider. The way it was franchised at the peak of the movement, we had a daily news sheet from the Labour Club, and there would be another daily news sheet from at least 4 or 5 other groups around the campus, based on engineering faculties, science faculty, medicine, etc., would have their own news sheets. And there would probably be an equal number from competing left trends, had their own news sheets, would have been weekly or fortnightly. But even the daily one that was run by the Labour Club ruling clique, as we were called, had a separate editorial team for each day of the week, and they all ran different fucking lines, which, led to inter-party struggle, which was what the organisation was for. And so we had a slogan that if there is to be a revolution, there has to be a revolutionary party, and we invited people to a party every Friday night at Jasmine Street. And it would tend to be a bit of a drunken orgy, but it would also be raging arguments about what line Print should be taking on the events of the day. And that's the way you organise in a mass struggle. And there was a Young Communist League, and I'm quite proud of the fact that in 1969, I'll give a link to it, we published, or not didn't publish, it was surreptitiously circulated, a proposed reading guide to study some Marxist theory and things, but nobody wanted to study Marxist theory. They only wanted to study actual strategy and tactics, in the course of which it became useful to study Marxist theory, right? Because some of the philosophical writings about how you look at the world and how the world is always changing and things really helps you clarify strategy and tactics. We didn't get much help from Mao as to how to organise a peasant war against Japanese imperialism, but we did get some help from the fact that, yes, you've got inter-party struggle. So I simultaneously agree that the so-called Vanguard, in fact, when we organised Red Eureka Movement after the Marxist-Leninist Party here collapsed into supporting Chinese fascism, there was immediately these people trying to make us start organising a new party. And we ended up putting out two executive statements, because we couldn't agree on a single one. I think David wrote one of them, "Playing tin soldiers is unimportant." Unite. Okay. Well, and the other one was party building is bullshit. And, you know, and it was, right? There were all these little sects pretending that they were building parties, and I think we remarked that we didn't even have enough people to form a cabinet if we were invited to take part. So, you know, it was just complete nonsense, the claims of party building. But in a mass movement, you do organise the best forces to organise as a vanguard and help propel things forward. And its main function as a vanguard, and I think Alison does have some of this spirit, right? One of my favourite sayings from now is that going against the tide is a Marxist principle. And I recall in 1984 that you would have had that lived experience of going against the tide, right? That it's quite difficult and people come and descend on you from all directions and so on. But it is a fundamental Marxist principle to go against the tide. And the other one I really like from now, that also sheds light on this, is that it is very dangerous to study Marxism unless you have a conquering spirit, because it can cramp your mind. And the people who did study Marxism not as part of theory that they were reaching for because they needed, you know, to analyse tactics and struggle and what's going on in the world around them, the people who just studied Marxist theory ended up becoming Martian academics, and they spelt it wrongly, but they were from Mars and they had cramped minds. And you know, there's a major distinction between Martianism and Marxism.
Maybe I'll just interject very quickly, because I find it's fascinating, Andy, that you had sort of agreed with this slogan of Chairman Mao's that it is right to rebel. But as Alison brought up, rebel towards what? And you raised this task of solidarity. But again, it beckons solidarity for what purpose? What is solidarity an end, or is it a means to something? And what role would a party play, or not a party play, in the clarification of that end?
Solidarity means helping another person under their direction. That presupposes that you don't want to see that other party defeated and extinguished, so you have to find some commonality. But you don't negotiate the aim. Solidarity means, I see you're fighting for so-and-so, what can I do to help? That's all. It just comes down to what can I do to help? And if that ethic is universal, then that's called socialism. I have only the vaguest notion of what that means institutionally speaking, but I do know it's a world in which everyone will say, how can I help? Just a couple of things. This is responding to Arthur. My mother, back in the 1930s, was a commercial artist, and with her Communist Party friends, she organised the first union of commercial artists. The central demand of the Union of Commercial Artists was achievement of professional status, and of course with that, professional salaries. They achieved that demand, and that was the end of the union. The Marxism, as you expressed it at one point, Arthur, has this same conundrum. If the purpose is the abolition of the working class, then you've got a problem, haven't you? Because the supposed, or presumed, agent of the revolution is setting about to get rid of itself. So, you know what I mean? There's a problem there, isn't it?
It's delightful.
It's a delightful problem, I agree. It's a creative issue, but it needs to be confronted. Yeah? Because sort of social democracy has, in a sense, taken away, as you know, a lot of... Look, they referred to feminism before. Women's liberation, as it appeared in the 60s, sort of 70s in Australia, was revolutionary. It had a vision of a different world. But that you weren't going to get that different world other than by engaging women, right? But the masses of women weren't motivated by a vision of the end of patriarchy. So you established with women's refuges, equal pay, and a number of concrete measures which motivated women. And that's what you described as becoming conservative, because as you achieve that, yeah, the revolutionary vision is gone. So there is this dynamic that has to be dealt with. Yeah?
A permanent revolution.
Yeah, permanent revolution, that's very nice. Look, just one little last thing, little thing. I know you both have said that I'm pessimistic. I apologise for giving that impression. We live in a world that is fundamentally pessimistic, right? As revolutionaries, we can't be, and we aren't. But, I mean, the meaning of the word postmodern is essentially the inability to conceive concrete of utopia. That's the world we live in. And so in that sense, we have to go against the stream. But of course, in order to make a revolution, you have to be with the stream. There's another contradiction for you. If you're always fighting against the stream, you're never going to lead anything. Right? So you have to be with the zeitgeist, you know, and there's no revolution without a revolutionary zeitgeist. So I'm just pointing out that, yes, as revolutionaries, we're optimists, we're good, what's his name, the Italian guy, Gramscian, you know, but we do live in a world which is pessimistic. Yeah, I mean the collapse of the fucking ecosystem. You know, there's some pessimism for, and it's very well grounded.
One of the things that cheers me up is that, to me, the people who endlessly talk about the weather are characteristic of the Menzies era. That was the level of conversation then.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of people talking about the weather and talking about extinction and saving the planet, but I think it's imploding. Right? I'm cheery because, to me, the things that make one gloomy are things like the green left and people going on and on about extinction, and they're clearly irritating everybody. It's not just me. There's a massive backlash against the people crapping on about intersectionalism and what language you should use and so on. Like there was a question here on the agenda was something about how do you reach social? Has social emancipation become obscured or something?
More or less obscured than in the 60s.
Yeah,
Can you read out the phrase?
Has the task of social emancipation become more or less obscure since the 1960s?
Right.
And I said it's more of a long-term project.
Okay. To me, it wasn't a task, it was a joy. We really enjoyed being troublemakers, and I still enjoy being a troublemaker. Secondly, the phrase social emancipation is obviously designed to obscure. Nobody would write down the task of social emancipation if they weren't trying consciously to obscure the issues. Right? I read out my position. I say I'm a communist. I disdain to conceal my views and aims. We openly stand for the forcible overthrow of all social conditions. That gets turned into a mumble about social emancipation. Even in the 19th century, the people who like to mumble about social emancipation ended up calling themselves socialists, which is why Marx and Engels couldn't write a socialist manifesto. Socialism was bourgeois in 1847. Right? This language that we're talking like there was no trans day and intersectionalism and so on during the movement at Monash, but the secretary of the Labour Club, Jill Cassidy, ended up changing her name to Jules, and she was a very butch dyke at the time. And I'm not sure exactly whether she was transgender in the end, but anyway, she did switch from Jill to Jules. The secretary of the Labour Club was married, and there was a threesome with the president of the NLFA committee, and it was, definitely it wasn't an issue for. I mean, I remember some people from Queensland, from the left there, were rather puzzled about how degenerate Monash was, etc. But it just wasn't an issue. We were busy on the overall 60s fight, and of course there were gay people stepping forward and
gay people who went on to form an autonomous movement and went on to form an autonomous movement because we experienced homophobia and transphobia in the broader left. The voices that dominated within the anti-war movement, queers and women did not want to simply be helpmates. What was going on was a fight for liberation. And one of the things that you'd said, Arthur, was that what drew people into the 60s mass movement was the war in Vietnam. That was one of the things that drew people into the 60s mass movement. There was a hell of a lot more that also drew people into the 60s mass movement. The civil rights struggle, the treatment of First Nations people,
What underlays
sexism.
that though, if there were many different causes, proximal causes to get involved in revolutionary oppositional movement, what underlay that? Why were all these different, disparate causes appearing?
Why were all these disparate causes appearing? It was an era. It was a time when people were, as you said, Arthur, starting to rebel, and people were rebelling and raising their demands, raising the things that impacted them as working class people.
Why though? Why then? Why not 50 years before?
Well, 50 years before there were smaller groups, who were raising these things.
We're talking 1918 now.
No, I'm talking about in the 50s. The objective conditions in the 50s of McCarthyism meant that for women's liberationists and for the homophile organisations that were organising in the 50s, it was the times, the impact of McCarthyism. But in the 60s, things were changing and people were raising a whole host of demands. And I think it is very, very wrong to say that the movement of the 60s won and so everybody packed up and went home. For First Nations people, for women, for the queer community, the fight continued. And when we look, here in Australia, that struggle seamlessly continued from the 60s into the 70s, which was when I got involved, and there was, that was when, I became a Marxist feminist. I got involved in the autonomous gay movement, and that was where I was exposed to the ideas and came to understand that women's oppression, that racism, that homophobia and transphobia, that all of these things were rooted in the class system. But what we need to understand is it was the 80s and the era of the Accord, that really had such a negative effect. It certainly had an immensely negative effect on the trade union movement, and a lot of what we're left with today, I would say, comes from that.
Yeah. See, Alison, you said earlier in midst of your talk that the position that your party took back then, in the 70s or whatever, is as right now as it was then. Right? So nothing changes. The program was right there.
No, that's not, that is not in fact what I said. I said that the project of working to build a vanguard party is as right now as it was then.
Why was it rejected by Marx in the 19th century? Right. The project of the Marxists was to overthrow capitalism and abolish all the social relations. Your project is to build some organisation. No. That is not the Freedom Socialist Party's project to build some organisation. What our project is to not have like a generation sitting here decades later and, like asking, like why our environment has collapsed, why we're faced with barbarism. That's what our project is. Our project is that we're actually serious about wanting to make a revolution. Now, Andy, like in your opening remarks, Andy, you were clear about what your theory was, but like then you said, that no, like you didn't know what your, like practice, what the practice.
Marxism disappeared somewhere in the early 20th century. I couldn't see it around me. Yeah.
Right, okay, well, and so...
That was
like,
me then,
yeah.
Of course, that's whatever, 50 years ago.
Yeah, and that's it. And Arthur, the things, like that bring you joy, what, my goodness, like joy, like in the weakness, that you call of the pseudo left. Well, like I'm sorry, I have not given up. The Freedom Socialist Party has not given up.
Nor has anyone else, and no one here has given up.
Yeah, like if people seriously think that what is needed in late capitalism, with what we face now, with fascists trying to organise, with growing like inter-imperialist rivalries, and the environment like in crisis, is blogs. I'm sorry, I just don't think like blogs cut it. Blogs.
I was going to raise that issue. I think it's a step forward that Platypus is organising a bit online and is doing things like having this video through YouTube. But honestly, the revolution won't be televised and it won't be on blogs. It'll be a massive real-time role-playing game about how we propose to run the world, which will gradually transform into an active supply chain management system that is actually running the world. It certainly won't be blocked, but the reason I'm happy, I can see that 100 million people are using GitHub, where they're able to organise large-scale cooperative projects like the Linux kernel, and most of the internet is built by using the communist mode of production on places like GitHub. It's quite easy, therefore, to organise groups that can discuss drafts of documents and things and exchange the drafts democratically and openly. You can have your Zoom calls and Skype calls without registering with some services and Jitsi. I'll put up links to them. But what makes me really happy is some of the things that make people in the pseudo left depressed. It would be really depressing if you were one of these vanguard groups that is taking a heroic struggle for intersectionalism or whatever, to be noticing that all the young people are laughing at you, right? That there's people actually running around bloody Trump because they're so sick of hearing from the politically correct ideologists of the Democratic Party, right? And people telling them that we need a voice to Parliament in Australia is the big issue of our times. We've got to rally around this totally bankrupt Labor Party in defence of Aboriginals who will otherwise be exterminated.
Who's saying that? Who in the pseudo
We're-
left,
Oh,
what you call the pseudo
Sorry,
left, who is
I'm
saying that?
probably.
Who's saying rally
I
round the
think
Labour
you've correctly.
Party
I
and
think
cause?
you've correctly exposed a fallacy in my argument. It's more what we're getting from the media than from the pseudo left, right? The ALP. The pseudo left ostentatiously does say, yes, we're not the Labour Party, but when it comes to the crunch, I do believe that you tend to actually be feeling that we're under threat from fascism, not because we're actually under threat from fascism, but because it makes it more militant to be denouncing the so-called right wing, if you call them fascists. Whereas there is an actual fascist war in Europe. Anyway, look, sorry, I agree, you pulled me up correctly. That's not what the pseudo-left does. But what the pseudo-left does is support political correctness, right? There is a whole move for corporate liberals saying, this is how you're allowed to speak, this is how you're allowed to write, we've got to have more censorship of the internet and so on. There's no way anyone who lived through the 60s could possibly find themselves in favour of shutting down free speech. And a good explanation of why not was given in a quite right-wing book by
So,
Jonathan
but
Malthus.
who says that in the so-called, like what you call the pseudo-left? Like
I think
what
each of
people
those
argue
vanguard
is
organisations is
against-
set up for the purpose of shutting down free speech.
Oh,
That I gave the slogan, join us and you need never think
okay,
again.
and what I will say, like I'd actually written that down because within a healthy, democratic, centralist organisation, all members are involved in developing the political program. And in terms of our political program on the question of the Ukraine, we all carefully studied and read Trotsky's piece, learned to think, and like that is one of the things that we need to do. We need to be
So
constantly.
how did you come up with dismantling NATO at the same time as wanting more arms for Ukraine? How would that survive a genuine internal debate?
How that survives a genuine internal debate is what we're looking at is something very dialectical. We support the right of the Ukrainian people to self-determination. We do not support the Zelensky regime. We are standing in solidarity and listening to Ukrainian socialists who are fighting to defend their homes from an imperialist aggressor from the authoritarian Putin regime. And we say that Ukrainians must have a right to get arms from anywhere where they can get them from.
Have you got anywhere in
But
mind
that
apart from
does,
NATO?
but that does not mean that we are going to be supporting US imperialism. We oppose the US military-industrial complex, and it is quite possible for serious Marxists to do both, and that is what we're doing. And I'd urge people, get a copy of the resolution from our last convention, which goes into all of our nuanced thinking about the question of
What's
Ukraine.
nuanced?
Arthur, let's
In
just
that
let's
discussion,
just
wouldn't it come up?
Arthur, let's just pause there because I want to get to the audience. Certainly, I think the point of this panel, which we've touched on here, is that if and when a new mass movement arises, there is a chance they will reach for Marxism to clarify the history of such mass movements. And we would want to capture what the Marxists of the 20th century would have to say to the Marxists of the 21st century about the possibilities of Marxism for radical transformation. But with that, let's go to the audience for quick Q&A. Hopefully we can get an hour in before we wrap up. I want to take one question at a time, and I'll take a speaking list, and so come up to the microphone. Again, keep your question to the point, and we can try and get through as many questions as possible if we have time. Yes, the gentleman at the back, please come up and ask your question.
Can I speak from here?
No, please come to
It's
the
just the
front.
microphone, if that's all right.
Now, I've heard a number of references to the ecological crisis, and picked up a pamphlet from the Freedom Socialist Party on eco-socialism. Now, one of the movements that came out of the 60s was the environmental movement. And by and large, that was a middle-class movement. But beginning about 1980, with the work of people like Andre Ports, you had the development of what we might call ecological Marxism or eco-socialism. And author, I'm a little bit puzzled because we're living in an era of ecological crisis, climate change. Things are looking very, very bad. And I hear you bagging the so-called green left. Now here in Melbourne, there are a number of groups that are part of that. Socialist Alliance, which I happen to be a member of, not a dogmatic member. They're going to have a conference, 2-day conference next weekend here. Solidarity, I think, has embraced eco-socialism. And even Socialist Alternative, which has been a little bit slow on the uptake, has come to embrace, they don't use the term eco-socialism, they're probably more ecological Marxist. But are you kind of following author into a climate denialist kind of camp? I'm a little bit puzzled by your bagging the green left and referring to them as the pseudo-left.
Okay. No, I'm a medieval technology denialist, right? I think there is a serious climate problem which requires serious engineering, serious research and development, given the catastrophic support for climate alarmism from the bourgeoisie, who are actively funding mass movements in support of climate alarmism. It is more or less inevitable that the only shift that we can make plausibly to deal with the climate problems is going to be to nuclear power, because they're not putting any R&D into fundamental technologies that could deliver efficient power. And instead, the funding is being diverted for purely corrupt reasons into things like windmills, which are from medieval times, and solar panels, which are relatively modern, but both of which require massive amounts of storage, which we simply don't have. So I regard the eco-socialists, one feature of them is that they're doing real damage to the necessary engineering that has to be done to deal with climate change. But more importantly, their ideology of catastrophe, gloom and doom goes back to Malthusianism, which is the ancient enemy of socialism and communism. Right? That our view is that developing the productive forces makes it inevitable that we have to change our social relations to correspond to them. Whereas the stuff coming out of eco-socialism is that we're all doomed. We have to live a narrower and more cramped lifestyle within the limits of our environment. And to me, it's the antithesis of any kind of left program. And so, yes, I am genuinely hostile, and I am comforted by the fact that this is an increasingly widespread view. You may regard it as being the fascists like Trump and so on the cause of it. I would say it is more the other way around. People are so disgusted with the tripe they're getting from the Democrat Party about how they should accept lower living standards for this reason and that reason, that they're turning to total demagogue populists like Trump. It's a symptom, not the cause. But people are rejecting the climate alarmism, they're rejecting the political correctness, and I think they will end up rejecting people like Trump, who all they've got to say for themselves is, yeah, we're against them, we're not politically correct, we're not for lowering your living standards, etc., which is not going to carry them all that far.
Very nice last segment on eco-social.
Just briefly, Arthur, I think your polemic was not a polemic against eco-socialism. It displayed a misunderstanding of eco-socialism, because what you criticised was alarmism and people being urged to take individual actions, but eco-socialism is in fact a call that capitalism as a system cannot solve the climate crisis, and we need to get our skates on. That young people who are very worried about what the generations before them have bequeathed to them, like in terms of the environment, this is something which will radicalise a new generation to be taking things forward and getting rid of the capitalist system, so that we can have the planning and we can have the technological R&D that you say we need, and that I would agree we need, but which capitalism is not going to deliver.
I'd just say there's every reason for alarm, and we don't need any isms around this question. But since I'm pushing solidarity, what can be more definitive of solidarity than defending the commons? Don't care what class is involved, defending the commons is that which unites. Yeah? When I first heard about the climate crisis, Ted Heath and Willy Brandt were its advocates, and I reacted in a typical 1968 way of dismissing it as a result. Silly reasoning. There's every reason for alarm, and it provides a very sound basis for solidarity.
Okay, Tom, do you want to answer?
Yeah. Thank you guys, it's been a really lively discussion, it's been great. One thing that hasn't been raised as much as you might expect, given that the topic is 1968, are students. And so I wondered what the lessons were about students and their role in Marxist politics from the 60s broadly, and the implications today. So just ask you to reflect on the question of students.
Yeah, it was really not so much a question of students, but age. In 68, they were rebelling in high school as well. They might never have gone on to being university students. There was a period in the 70s when the left turned away from students because during the 70s you had a big rise of activism among the working class, and you had in Australia, what did the DSP call it? The turn to industry. I mean, I did a turn to industry as well, simply on the basis of my own judgment. I went and started working in a factory. But then when the workers' activism died out, the turn of the left back to the universities was simply scraping the barrel, in my view. If you're going to build the party, you need some young recruits. Necessary, but it's not because there's an upsurge in students going on.
I think that in relation to campuses today, you'd be very hard-pressed to find many students who are not also workers, and there is an immense overlap. that many students are in fact insecure workers. You know, they're workers in retail, they're workers in the hospitality industry, they're casual labour hire workers working in contact centres. And students are very much workers in training. And we think it's important to be orienting to young people and to orient to young people as workers, whether they're also studying.
Yeah. Well, I think Alison's right
Can you come forward a bit into the microphone?
Sorry. My recollection is that would be correct, that the universities were very different in the 60s. They were a much more middle class institution. And part of the role, I do think it was more than Andy said, that there was a role of students as being the detonator of a wider struggle that included a lot of other working class sections. But the students played that detonator role because they were in a somewhat privileged position, that they had time to think and that they were required to think. And I think the policy of the universities ever since has been, yes, we're stuck with having to have a tertiary educated working class, but we've got to make damn sure they don't have any time to think. So most students are now drawn from the working class, and they do have to work in order to pay for their studies, and they get filled with a whole lot of crap that gives them very little time to think. So I don't have any experience to pass on as to how one would organise on the campuses, because I think
they're not on the campuses nowadays either.
Right.
They're working in their McDonald's or something,
Yeah.
or working from home.
Yeah, so the way we organise things would be quite different from the way that student organising would happen now. But I think it's also a positive development that you do now have a large working class which is all on the internet, and they're all playing games. And what could be a more interesting game than how do we overthrow the system?
You know, for a long time, the young intelligentsia and the working class had a synergy. Right? 68 was actually the beginning of the breakup of that synergy. Now, you correct what you say, the young intellectuals, university students, did play that, sparking role, yeah? And that did happen. But it was like the beginning of an end, really, because like in Poland, the students and the workers were fighting each other. It's a contradictory kind of thing. What Alison said is correct, though, that the division, a dichotomy between young intellectuals and workers is a thing of the past. Students are workers in the main. It's true.
Come on, and then we'll go to the other one.
Arthur, this is a question probably drawn from something you said about the left being co-opted in the 1970s, not the 1870s, into professional NGO roles, etc., and takes us back to the overarching theme of this lessons from the 1968. Also keeping in mind that I've looked at Verity Archer from Federation University's work on neoliberalism and the Kent brothers. So, question is, do you think that the left gave enough understanding and credibility of the rights, analysis of us, and their ability to neuter the role of the left? For example, postmodernism in academia, or clouding the issue of class, so that a group like the Greens, which is really a petty bourgeois party, is seen as left or pseudo-left.
I'm not familiar with the authors that you mentioned, but I'd agree that the ruling class put a lot of effort into understanding us, and we didn't develop a sufficiently high theoretical level to analyse what they were analysing. And in particular, the Whitlam era was a bit of a surprise. That I was expecting that it would just be a very minor switching parties that wouldn't change the overall situation much. And in fact it did, that they recruited vast amounts of people. If you wanted to be politically active and do some good, the first thing you've got to do is apply for government funding. Because they were offering it, right? And you could get funded to do all kinds of progressive causes. And the sort of people that we were organising ended up being organised into non-government organisations. It's not true that the Green movement grew out of the 60s left. I remember the New Left Club at Monash, which was formed in opposition to the Labour Club that was a revolutionary Marxist organisation. But they were pushing stuff like Marcuse and the latest theories from Eastern Europe and so on. But I ran into the guy that founded it, was Ron Brunton. He ended up working for a right-wing think tank and told me, yes, you were right about me being bourgeois. But he said that he'd done a study of the student newspapers in that period to check out where the green stuff had come from. And the only green article he found was a review of Rachel Carson's book on Silent Spring, right? It just simply wasn't a part of the 60s at all. It was definitely introduced from outside to take people away from radical politics. And postmodernism, I think Camille Paglia said it very, very clearly, that the sorts of people who got into academic positions after the 60s were selected for their brain deadness or whatever. You certainly didn't get radical activists being recruited to become part of the campus academics. So you end up with all these new forms of socialist Marxist academia that have been consciously recruited to spread postmodernist crap. And I rather like Camille Paglia saying they should just be floated out to sea, because they and again, they irritate everybody, right? The postmodernism things, and it's not unique to old Marxists from the 60s to find the crap coming out of academia to be crap, and that's why I'm feeling quite positive about it. I feel quite positive about the fact that yes, a whole lot of those things that were set up to divert a movement in the 60s are falling to bits now. Right, that it's to me a grounds for optimism is mainstream politics is visibly falling apart. I mean, the next election looks like being between Trump with a black senator as his vice presidential candidate against Biden and Kamala Harris, and it's going to be pretty awful if Trump and the black senator win. I can't remember his name, Scott somebody, but it's going to be pretty boring. I think Zizek said it about Hillary Clinton, that he couldn't imagine voting for her because it would just perpetuate this thing going on. The mainstream politics is visibly falling to bits, and pseudo-left politics is visibly falling to bits. It's bound to have a bit of a revival just because mainstream politics. But to me, one requires things to fall to bits in order for there to be a mass movement. That was the precursor to the 60s, was the 50s. It was the Menzies era that paved the way for a radical left in Australia in the 60s.
We'll check the next question here.
Sorry about that. I'm unsure if the panel is aware of Ken Mansell's work, The East is Red. It pretty much focuses on the Melbourne student movement in the 60s and 70s, but one of the arguments he made was that the cleavage between the old left and the new left was far less distinct and far more collaborative than compared to France or the US. Does the panel agree with that argument? If so, how was it collaborative? Or if not, how was it antagonistic? Thank you.
I wasn't here at the time, and nor was Alison, so
Ken Mansell's a curious phenomenon because he was in the Young Communist League, and that's why he's got copies of that internal publication I mentioned, Bolshevik. So we'd formed it as, to be open to people like Ken Mansell, and people in their youth go in all directions. And he was also living with us at the bakery, which was the headquarters at the time. So he would have experienced the fact that there was a dynamic where we weren't sectarians. We had anyone that was active in the movement, and he was, was welcome, and people were arguing out their politics. And it wasn't that kind of sectarian shit that is characteristic of a lot of what happened subsequently. So he would have experienced the fact that, yes, we were having passionate arguments with people like him, and that's the way movement developed. Now, I reckon he developed in the wrong direction, and we developed in a better direction, but we were in favour of it. It wasn't so much collaboration, it was argument, right? That you can't develop your own ideas unless you're willing to argue with people with other ideas.
Yeah, I mean, speaking for the period immediately before '68, before I left the country, the Communist Party people were, they were very active, but they were sort of underground active. Like they ran the folk music scene, and my parents magically gave me a guitar for Christmas one day. So I took an interest in that, and I was surrounded by these people, actually Communist Party members. I didn't know, and my impression is, as the movement towards '68 started popping up, it was welcomed by the older generation, but that welcoming wasn't particularly reciprocated by us. That I've said I've regarded the whole left from before as really being implicated in the whole thing. But on the whole, the Communist Party members at the time were supportive of the movement, and I was in England, so I don't know what was happening in here. It would not surprise me at all if the relationship was collaborative.
Well, I think that would have been a difference here, that there was a major split in the ALP in the 50s, and the communists were fairly dominant in the remnants of the ALP, or were fairly major influence. But my recollection, when I was 14, I was Secretary of Youth Against Apartheid, and I was quite puzzled about the fact that the people who said that they were in the Communist Party and that they were in the Eureka Youth League, its youth organisation, they seemed to be more conservative than average.
Yeah.
And there were these other people who said they'd left it and...
Yeah, they were socially conservative.
They were socially conservative and politically conservative. And there were other people also at the South Africa protest meetings who said, no, we're not in the Communist Party and we left it and things like that. And I didn't understand what that was about, but that was in 1963, so it was just when the international communist movement had split. So we did have the phenomena that there were people in Melbourne who had split from the old party, who were quite a major force in Melbourne. And unlike Sydney and unlike the UK, they were completely insignificant in the UK, completely insignificant in
That's right.
And we had genuine support, I thought, at the time, and I still think, that they were very supportive. They were enthusiastic about us following our own path and learning to think for ourselves. So I can't explain why they ended up...
It was a Melbourne phenomenon.
It was a Melbourne phenomenon, yeah. But I can't have got it quite right about them, because they ended up supporting the fascist regime in China for 50 years or so. I've read recently that they've suddenly realised that it was fascist, but that must be a second generation of them.
Yeah.
But they were genuinely helpful, and they helped us get into contact with people on the wharves and build as labourers and build some genuine worker-student unity. So we did have that connection with the old left, but it wasn't from the CPA. My other recollection of being puzzled about it was for my bar mitzvah. The Zionists gave me certificates of trees in Israel and books about to emigrate to Israel. The revisionists gave me Yiddish folk tales, and there was one Marxist-Leninist who I was in central school then at 13, or 12 or 13, and I was mainly into shortwave listening and electronics, and they gave me a multimeter. So I didn't realise it at the time, but it was part of the difference between the people that had a Marxist-Leninist background and the other political trends.
Yeah, if I can just briefly comment. Andy, you talked about the social conservatism, and I think that like amongst the old left, was very, 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 very slow to be embracing things like gay liberation. You know, like I know like FSP was highly unusual in terms of diving in and being on the front lines of that struggle from the get-go. And like I know when I got involved in the late 70s, that was one of the things that was really important about an autonomous LGBTIQ plus movement, you know, that we were like going at, like as a movement and like intervening. I remember the Karl Marx Centenary Conference at University High, where the movement, you know, intervened and like insisted that gay liberation was something that needed to be programmatically a part of the left, and you know that we were making the theoretical case for that link by pointing to works such as Engels' Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, which like is absolutely crucial for understanding not only where patriarchy came from, but also homophobia and transphobia.
Can I also ask, what was the relationship between the FSP and the older American Trotskyists once the sort of split had been made? Was there sort of an antagonism? Was it less of a tension there?
Well, the Freedom Socialist Party, the whole of the Seattle branch of the Socialist Workers' Party left to become the Freedom Socialist Party. So, like in the early days, there wasn't an SWP in the city where we were organising, but our orientation is always towards seeking to build united fronts, and we do work with other leftists of every stripe. We work with anarchists. We work with mass movements. So where we want to be theoretically distinct, but we want to unite to fight in the interests of the working class wherever that is possible.
Debbie, would you like?
Hi, I'm Debbie. I'm a member of the Freedom Socialist Party, also Radical Women, and I'm a retired unionist from the education and the community sectors. I'm just saying that because I'm asking a question from that broad perspective. The period of 1968 to the early 70s was certainly a year of international explosion of movements and struggles, and just fast forwarding to today, we are also a world exploding with struggles and liberation movements. So if we're looking at, for example, the uprising of women in Iran and Afghanistan, the uprisings led by women across Latin America for reproductive justice and against femicide and so on, First Nation sovereignty, and I can name so many others. But given that we are living in a world in late capitalism, exploding again with these struggles, what do the panelists have to say as to what is needed now, especially given that we're all recognizing that we're faced with socialism or barbarism, we're facing a growing far-right and fascist movement. So in the here and now, and the vitality of those explosions that are happening all around the world, what is needed now to bring this to the kind of conclusion that I think we all want in this room.
Look, Debbie, the struggles going on in different countries are different. I mean, it's true we have a world crisis to a greater and deeper extent than ever before, but the fact is that that takes a very different form in every country. But I'm a bit familiar with Iran, for instance. I'm very hopeful for Iran. I am. It's a fantastically powerful, very sophisticated movement. But overwhelmingly, what the people of Iran aspire to is just to be an ordinary country like other countries, and not to be constantly at war with America and so on. And we have to keep that in mind. That I look forward in the next year or two to a revolution in Iran, and a popular revolution, not an American-inspired revolution. But just, I have to say to my dear, revolutionary Marxist Iranian friends, it's not going to be a straight transition to socialism. Likewise, we have quite a lot of commonality with what we say about Ukraine. What the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians want is just to be part of Europe, to share in that prosperity and have a normal life. Now, that happens to entail enormous eruptions, it means a war. But, that's why I find the present moment that the struggle for socialism is more realistic than it was in the 60s, where, unbeknownst to us, we had so much work to do ahead of us, which we were blind to. Now it's more realistic. We've come this extra 70 years or whatever, but I think we have to realise it's a long-term project. So we have countries that are aspiring to be ordinary bourgeois capitalist countries, and revolutions are going to be happening there, and look what we've got in Britain and America. For fuck's sake, this is not countries on the verge of reaching out for socialism. I'm sorry, they're not. We've got a long way to go. But I'm confident that we're going to head that way because, as I said, this thing about the climate is not alarmism. There is good cause for alarm. Things cannot go on in the old way. Things will break up. I agree, capitalism is scrape the barrel of economic manipulation, microeconomics, and anything. And it's exhausted its possibilities. But where it goes is an open question.
I think my whole presentation said what we think, but just to briefly recap, crucial to build a vanguard party, and that working in united fronts and recruitment are a key component part of that. But just to respond to Andy about what it is that people want, what it is that people are fighting for, and yes, people are aspiring to have good and happy lives, but proposing that people can share in the prosperity, what I would say is look around us in late capitalism. Look around us with the housing crisis. The housing crisis is absolutely monumental. One of my fellow union delegates with a permanent public service job who had just come back from long service leave and had a 12-year rental history, in her previous home, it took her 12 weeks to get a rental property, and she had to live insecurely during that 12 weeks, what would it be like for someone who is an insecure worker, for somebody who is on benefits, wages are flatlining at the moment and going backwards? I don't think, that there may be this image, that we can present of prosperity, but hey, look at the real lived reality, of the working class at the moment. Insecure work, it's absolutely crazy. So yes, there's the question of the environment, but there's a whole lot more. Who has a bulk billing GP? I ask you. Not too many people. How long do people have to wait to get a test done in a public hospital? This is working class reality in Australia, and I think to brand that as prosperity is wrong. And yes, okay, true that that there are some people who do believe in the capitalist dream, that it can bring wonderful things, and then they face the horrific reality of late capitalism, and that is the reality of most of the people who I know.
I'm inclined to agree more with Andy that it's going to be a long process and that we can't identify at the moment what the particular things are going to come together, but I certainly agree that Iran is one of the most optimistic ones, and that I can understand that you'd be particularly enthusiastic when there's a revolution that's the first slogan is women, freedom, etc. Women, life, freedom. Right, that would reinforce the FSP's world outlook considerably, because it's real, right? It's not somebody invented it there. It is actually a movement that has got that as its actual slogan. And I think it will have a major impact in that region. The Arab Spring got aborted by the US backing off from after it had overthrown the Saddam regime in Iraq, to the misery of the US foreign policy establishment. They were all against getting rid of it because it would destabilise the region. And it did destabilise the region, and the pseudo left was all against destabilising the region, and none of them protested when they were allowing Putin's lot to help Assad survive, etc. But anyway, the Arab Spring got crushed. I'm sure it's going to rise again. I don't know what's going on in Africa, but I imagine people are getting sick of kleptocracy there. But what was interesting about the 68 was that it was only 2 years after 66, and 3 years after 65, and I was politically conscious by 63, so I've got this vivid picture that I was living in the Menzies era, and it changed, and that struck me as the normal rate of change, right? If you're growing up in that period, then things change, and everything's getting shorter, and you're getting taller, and so on. But that seemed to me a normal rate of progress, that the political situation transformed rapidly over a couple of years, and that's what we'll see again in the next wave. So I can't predict how it'll develop. I don't think anyone could have predicted that there'd be simultaneously what was described for 68 rather well. That you had, I don't know whether you mentioned the Cultural Revolution in China, but you mentioned Czechoslovakia and
the Cultural Revolution in China was a bit later, wasn't it?
Well, it started earlier. I was in China in May '67, before the ping pong teams were exchanged between Australia and stuff, and I was given an honorary Red Guard armband by one of the leaders of the Red Guard, Tan Halan, the one with pigtails. But she was very clear that the Cultural Revolution and our sort of politics was against the same sorts of people, that they were fighting, what we were fighting. And that was but you couldn't really predict that they'd all come together. And waves do come together in ways that are impossible to predict in advance. Like you can see a tsunami arises because the tectonic plates have shifted, right? But it's hard to analyse without a lot of seismometers and things.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned that quote from Le Monde, which was saying nothing's happening 5 days before it broke out.
Yes, that's a
I remember all during my period as a Trotskyist, we were reminded of things like the short interval from 1905, a revolution, to 1908, reaction, to 1914, deeper reaction, to 1917, a revolution. That all these revolution and non-revolution, they change very quickly. And so there we were in the 70s and 80s and 90s waiting for these rapid changes to happen, which of course we had experienced. You know, if you lived through 68, you were very ready to accept that the zeitgeist could change in months.
Yeah. And it hasn't for 4 decades, but,
No.
we still know that it does change suddenly.
Yeah.
So we don't have to talk about how horrendous everything is and how terrific it is on the other hand. We know that it will change very suddenly, very rapidly, and very nicely, and this happens periodically throughout history.
And we need to be ready.
And there's no way to be ready. We know that too.
Yeah.
It's just a fact. You can't be ready for a tsunami. But you can be historically optimistic that people will think things through. And the more time you spend thinking, the better. But I just want to mention Alan Roberts was one of the two academics who were part of the Monash movement. He was a Trot, and he spoke at a meeting on this subject of how things were looking so good for us there in '68, or what I think it was in '68, probably this camp we were having, and he said, and think about the situation the Russians faced after the October Revolution, when the news was all bad, just like we're hearing good news from Paris, good news all around the world that there's struggles going on. They were hearing the defeat of the German Revolution, the defeat of the British general strike, and so on. And I thought that was quite a big thing, that they do alternate with periods of defeat. And one should not over-exaggerate how bad things are during any period or how good things were. It is an ongoing struggle, but it does come in waves. And catching a wave is a different art from whatever it is that vanguard parties, so-called, do. Catching a wave requires different skills.
It requires sensitivity to what's happening out there under those millions of roofs and supporting it, getting into it.
But one thing there's two things I've advocated as concrete that we can prepare for. One is that there's going to be an economic crash, and what you described about the stagnation in living standards and the slide going backwards, I think is going to be nothing compared with what actually happens in the Great Depression and what is likely to happen on a global basis, because it now is a globalised economy, and it's a good time to be studying economics. You know, don't spend your time on windmills and solar panels, but if you learn some economics...
It's a hell of a dichotomy there, Albert.
Yes, so there's a vast dichotomy. Study nuclear engineering if you want to get into energy technology.
Okay, let's just for sake of it, we've got 5 questions left and just under half an hour. So
can we study the business cycle, because we're about to be in one?
Okay, let's just go, Lucas, and let's keep the last 5 quick if we can, and then we've got a few here as well.
Yeah, I have a question for Arthur. Are you opposed to disbanding NATO in general, or just for the duration of the war in Ukraine? And if you don't think it should be disbanded, then what reason do you have for that, especially considering how NATO, and in particular US, have historically been one of the most powerful anti-communist forces in the world, if not the most powerful?
I think the most powerful anti-communist forces in the world were the communist parties, and NATO never actually got called into action against us, because they didn't need to be. I'm in favour of the abolition of the state when we've we've gone to the point of and then we have the withering away of the revolutionary state. And I can't really imagine NATO surviving that process of overthrowing all the bourgeois governments of Europe and North America. But in the immediate historical period, I would expect that not only will Ukraine win this war, they will also emerge as the largest military power in Europe and the leading force within NATO. I think Zelensky's already established himself as leader of the free world. Biden's flailing around behind, issuing press releases about how, no, it's me, I'm leader of the free world, I've got the arsenal. But Zelensky's actually doing quite well at mobilising people against the governments that he's dependent on for arms. I think more important than the Ukrainian victory is going to be the collapse of Russian fascism. And I think that's going to take a while. There's an insurrection at the moment in Russia that's coming from from the fascist mercenaries, but it literally broke out today, last night. But it's going to be a pretty major development for the whole of Eastern Europe, with implications for Western Europe, if that Tsarist fascist regime is gone. And there's bloody good reasons why Marx spent so much of the 19th century mobilising against Tsarism, and in particular with a rather jingoist thing about the Crimean War, like he was backing anybody that can defeat the Tsar. If you like to read the material on the Crimean War from Marx and Engels. So I think the Russian Revolution is going to be pretty important when they do deal with that fascist regime. And I think the Iranian one is too. But it's impossible to predict in advance. But we can be acting on the one that's there right now, which is Ukraine. Right? The reason Russia invaded was because there was a democratic revolution in Ukraine. And it was bourgeois democratic. And Tsarists intervened against bourgeois democratic revolution. And Marxism developed. There were no revolutionary communists in the 20th century who didn't start out as revolutionary democrats. Right? This term, the left, has become popularised in modern times, but the term was democrats. Right? That if you wanted to, if you were revolutionary, you had to overthrow various governments because you needed to establish a democracy. And naturally the bourgeoisie would end up running the democracy, and there would then be a struggle. I think Marx called it the winning the battle of democracy. There's a big gap between overthrowing some semi-feudal regime and the mass of workers actually being able to wield power.
It's in the Communist Manifesto, to win the battle of democracy.
Win the battle, thank you. It was in the Communist Manifesto, so there you go.
Okay, let's move on. Sophie, do you want to ask?
I'd like to first start by saying thank you to each of the panellists for speaking today. I feel like one of the most important things that today's left can do is metabolise the lessons of past left movements. If each panellist could briefly just say what they think the most important lesson we can take from 60s leftist movements might be. For example, is there an important success of the 60s left or an important failure?
I said in my talk, anyone who lived through that mass movement will never, forever be changed by that. And that's really what you have to go for. That's what you look forward to. And it arises out of circumstances, and we had that in the mid-60s, mass movements, and we have to retain that in a very different period, because the conditions that gave rise to mass movements in the 60s are now gone, forever gone, and can't be reproduced. So that's the challenge, really. I think there are conditions for mass movements again, but they're very different conditions. But we have to look for mass movements, not small cogs, but move large cogs, and manipulating movements in a way, and trying to lead groups in that sense. What Albert described within the safe confines of Monash University in that time, is what you want on a much larger scale, but you have to have conditions for that. But you want to reproduce those kinds of conditions of 1,000 newspapers collaborating, exchanging, not 1,000 editions of the party, organ.
I think that the most important lesson is that Marxism is a method. Marxism is not a dogma. We have to think, and the mistake that the Trotskyist movement in the US was making in the 50s and into the early 60s was it did not recognise the opportunities, the changes. It did not recognise where the revolutionary dynamism was coming from black workers and from women, and we always have to continue to think and to apply Marxism to the period that we're in and to the challenges and the opportunities that that period brings. And I would say that a vanguard party or small nuclei that are seeking to build a vanguard party are a place to do that and to continue to sift and synthesise and apply the lessons of history to the contemporary struggles we face today.
Well, on the mistakes, I would say us not getting to grips with Marxist economic theory was an unavoidable mistake. There's no way we could have got people to be studying economics during a period of great economic prosperity and a major Vietnam War, but it would be a criminal mistake to continue not studying economic theory now. And so I recommend Max Sikowski as a good place to start from. On the positive lessons, I think they were well expressed by Marx when he broke with the left Hegelians under the slogan, uncloak these sheep. And he was referring to the sheep in wolves' clothing.
Wolf in sheep's clothing?
No, sheep in wolves' clothing was Marx's expression.
Right, I haven't read that one. No.
Wolf in sheep's clothing was Little Red Riding Hood, who was devoured by the monster. Whereas the sheep Marx was talking about was the left Hegelians, who were full of passionate denunciations of the world they lived in and of ringing declarations that they would revolutionise it. And their method of revolutionising it was not exactly building a vanguard party, but something a bit similar. And Marx describes it this way. Once upon a time, a valiant fellow had the idea that men were drowned in water only because they were possessed with the idea of gravity. If they were to knock this notion out of their heads, say by stating it to be a superstition, a religious concept, they would be sublimely proof against any danger from water. His whole life long he fought against the illusion of gravity, of whose harmful results all statistics brought him new and manifold evidence. This valiant fellow was the type of the new revolutionary philosophers in Germany. And so Marx and Engels set...
I thought that was Lenin in 1908.
Well, he had similar...
He was quoting Marx, was he?
He would have been quoting Marx. It's from the German Ideology. It's the preface to the German Ideology. It's up on your website, Marxist.org. And the point is, that was the lesson we did have from the 60s. Our enemy was the previous left, right? We were clear about that. I think even the Trots claimed that the previous left they were fighting was the Stalinists, and you know that this was about 20 years after the so-called Stalinists had denounced Stalin, said that he was a mass murderer, etc. But they were of the opinion that the old communist parties were their enemy, and they were. The Maoists were certainly of the opinion that they were the enemy, and you know they were fighting us in the streets in Paris. The left generally in Australia, the CPA type left, was trying to clamp down on the anti-war movement. You weren't supposed to carry the left flags or burn American flags and stuff like that.
You wrap it up quickly.
Okay, so that Marx gave the first example, and I'm sure Lenin did quote him, that we do fight against a pseudo-left. You can't have a real left without demolishing the pseudo-left. And we demolished them in the 60s. naturally they grew up again when we faded away.
Steve? And then I've got two more, just this woman here and then the gentleman at the back.
Thanks everyone for the vigorous debate. Something that Platypus Silvus mentions is the post-68 revisiting of Marx, reinterpretation, rereading. From your experiences or what you understand of this period, what were the fiercest disagreements about Marx in the wake of, or during or in the wake of 68, and which were there particular texts that were raised up, and were there particular aspects of Marxist thought that were played down or jettisoned completely?
Look, I don't think... I did no reading of Marx before I became a Trotskyist. There was not really a lot of reading of Marx after that. It was all Lenin and Trotsky. The big rereading of Marx in my lifetime was in the turn of the millennium, and you had a thing called Back to the Real Marx, meant actually reading Marx, and the subtext of that movement was Marxism of the 20th century was, can I put it, a diversion. You know, the essential revolutionary content of Marx had been lost, and that was really what guided me. You know, for all I respect Lenin and Trotsky and the movements they built, I go back to Marx and his sources in Hegel. I think the Russian Revolution had a profound effect on the development of Marxism, which actually hasn't been very helpful. The revolution itself, you know, obviously is transformative, but the theoretical impact of the doctrine, you know, that Allison so correctly describes, that you take it off the shelf and you apply it to the world, that's an idea of the 20th century Marxism which needs to be thoroughly disposed of. But the period after 68, didn't find that really was a particular element. You know, it was very much Lenin and Trotsky and so on. That was my experience anyway.
I'd say that some of the fiercest disagreements within the movements have not really been things of substance. Those of us who are Marxists talk within the movements about what we get from Marxism and its importance, and often people who are new to Marxism will, you know, like go and read Marx or read something like Engels, The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, and through 21st century eyes they'll freak out by the language. They'll freak out about terms like savagery and barbarism and, you know, like talk of mankind. And so it's so important, I think, to study collectively, to be able to get to the essence of these texts and to get beyond superficial things, the comments, you know, that Marx has nothing to offer feminism, or the comments that Marx has nothing to offer the environmental movement, to be able to study together and, you know, look at what Marx had to say about the soil, for example. So the main thing I'd say is collective study to get beyond the surface disagreements and like really get to the essence.
I haven't followed much of what the pseudo-left has been studying. I've judged them by their political activity. My impression is that the new left was basically invented, like we were told that our theoretician was Marcuse, who who we'd never heard of and never taken any interest in, and they got really interested in a whole lot of East European philosophers or whatever, and they got interested in the young Marx, and it all struck me as a great diversion. But we weren't actually able to persuade many of the 60s activists to do much study of Marxism. We did try. Foreign Languages Press in Peking had pamphlet copies that cost practically nothing of all the relevant works, including the ones you mentioned, Engels, Family, Private Property and the State, etc. They were available and they were out in the bookstores and so on. But the one that unfortunately was most read was Lenin's pamphlet on imperialism, and I would tend to agree with Andy that did some damage. I wouldn't blame Lenin for it. I think it was a pamphlet written in the situation of the First World War, but bizarrely, people regarded it as an anti-imperialist movement instead of, and we were sort of welcoming that. A lot of people who supported us on the Vietnam War and were fighting against US imperialism would call themselves anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist, and that seemed to be a step towards being communists. But it actually turned out that it wasn't. You could be a very strong and vigorous anti-imperialist while supporting Russian fascism, for example, at the moment. Like your group has opposed Russian fascism. Some of these anti-imperialist groups are supporting Russian fascism. So the content, and they've all read Lenin's pamphlet. So I think it should be treated as a pamphlet from the First World War rather than as a major theoretical guide, which it was mistakenly understood as. And so I've also, like Andy, found it quite refreshing to be going back to some of the original Marxism, including even the German ideology, which is very obscure in terms of talking about left-wing Hegelians and so on. But there is a red thread running through it, right? It wasn't bullshit that Lenin was a Marxist and that they were fighting against the Orthodox Marxists of their day. It was Kautsky and Bernstein were the literary executives of Marx and Engels, and that they were overthrown by the Leninists developing Marxism. It wasn't by just learning it and learning it collectively, it was by overthrowing it, by renewing it. And Mao Zedong, a large part of his works were fighting off people. They were called the 28 and a half Bolsheviks. I think Zhou Enlai was the half Bolshevik, and the other 28 were Wang Ming and co. were trying to put a Comintern line for the Chinese Communist Party. A large part of Mao's effort was establishing a line for the Chinese Revolution against their wrong views. Our job isn't just to collectively study Marxism, but to renew it, and you renew it by understanding the world we live in. And certainly Marx, you can't get to grips with bourgeois economics without also studying Marxist economics.
I think Alison is right that reading together is essential to get started. For example, you can't understand Hegel if you just pick it up and read it. Can't be done.
Yeah, I agree, but I think that's because Hegel's pretty unintelligible. I think when people who are put off by Marx using expressions like savagery and barbarism and so on, should just be told to get a life, and they should, be encouraged to read it themselves rather than collectively. But
over and above collective reading, it's really important to read it yourself.
Yes.
Yeah. That collective reading is all very well, for dealing with how to understand the stuff. But collective reading is dangerous as well. Yes. I don't like people telling me how I should read a text.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. And certainly anyone taking part in collective reading they've got to have read the fucking book before they turn up at the collective discussion.
Cool.
Yeah, it goes without saying.
Come right here in the middle. Do you have a question?
So my question is, there's a real need for Marxist analysis within our movements, predominantly because this unites our struggles. How can we best bring this analysis to new generations of working people in a way that's accessible and easy to understand? And do we not need organisations like revolutionary parties, not only to educate, but also to support workers in these fights so that they don't burn out? It seems to me that solidarity among individuals is not enough to alleviate the pressures of capitalism.
Yeah, well, solidarity is in its nature collective practice. I think organised parties have a certain role in, can I put it, like apprenticeship, so to speak, to provide a place where you can be introduced to what are important texts and get some, you know, if you don't happen to be in a location where it's possible to lead and to participate in critical struggles, then parties can help you by taking you somewhere. But it's a limited role, really, it's a limited role. Mostly wherever you are, and that isn't in a party, it's doing some job, you know, some social position. People have to learn how to be communists in that position. And if you talk about burnout, nothing burns out more effectively than parties. Parties are machines for burning out. There are more burnt out party members around by a factor of 10 than there are party members. Alison's an exception. Have maintained your comrades very well.
That's because of having experience swimming against the tide.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question, Amelia. I think I will just comment on solidarity before directly responding. It's something that was raised earlier as being very important, and we have a large banner on the wall at our organising centre, Solidarity Salon, and it's a quote from Lilla Watson, an Aboriginal woman, and she says, like, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time, but if you've come because you understand that your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And really, that is what solidarity is about. And that quote, like, I think is something that really resonates, like, with people. Like, it's one of the ways, I think, to make ideas accessible. Like it challenges white liberalism, and it shows that all of our struggles are like all bound up together, and that they're all bound up together through class and through the need to tackle the capitalist system. So it's really important that we make our ideas accessible, that we present our ideas in a range of ways, not only like in written format, you know, like things like podcasts, like videos, like social media, you know, all of these things are things that are really important to make our ideas accessible. But the key way that we actually make our ideas accessible is by using the method that we learn from Trotsky, that method being the transitional program. And the transitional program is not going to a book, you know, that was written last century and like picking slogans out of that book. Again, it's a method. And, you know, like it's a method that we need to be applying in the here and now. We go into movements and we raise demands that are of critical importance to those movements, whether it's, like a demand like free quality 24-hour childcare. What working parent, would not relate to a demand like free quality 24-hour childcare? But yet it is something that capitalism cannot deliver. And that, is what is important about that method. And, it's something, that we can, apply to any contemporary struggle by developing relevant demands that are things that people really relate to and need and want to fight for in the here and now, but which the capitalist system cannot deliver.
So you tell someone that needs childcare, 24-hour free childcare, sorry, you can't get that under capitalism, you have to wait for the revolution.
No, Andy, you don't tell them that. What you do is you get out and you fight and you build a movement, and you may not get it fully free. You may not fully get it.
So you keep it secret that you believe it's actually impossible under capitalism?
We don't keep it secret. We are quite honest about our methods. I'm also a member of Radical Women. Radical Women's Manifesto is a manifesto that is actually built on transitional demands, and people, and we don't need to be raising, being the ones to go forth and actually raise that demand. It's what parents are damn well raising, it's what they actually, need in the here and now. And we're not saying wait until after the revolution. We're saying get out and fight for it now. But that's about how we're actually building a movement, that takes things forward, and it's how we, the question that Amelia asked is how to connect with people. This is how to connect.
Okay, maybe we'll pause that. We'll just take one final question. If you have a response to that, we can, just because we're over time.
This is a question for all the panelists. Why should communists support the Banderite-friendly Ukrainian state, which is a proxy of American imperialism, when the correct position should be revolutionary defeatism against our own ruling classes and support for the Russian and Ukrainian workers against the ruling classes of their own states?
If I can go first, we do not support the Ukrainian state. We support the Ukrainian people, and we support the Ukrainian people and their right to self-determination. We stand with the Ukrainian people, and we also stand with the Russian anti-war movement and Russians who are seeking to topple the Putin regime. And we think that that's the correct position. And rather than calling for defeatism, we think that is an abstraction for ordinary people in the Ukraine, when they've got their cities being destroyed and bombs raining down on them. They've damn well got a right to defend themselves, and we'll support that right.
Absolutely.
It would take too long to give you the history of Banderism in Ukraine and why there is still a quite large right-wing Banderite sort of opposition there. But they're very much in the opposition. The reason that Russia invaded was because up until the invasion, up until Zelensky's election, there'd been a democratic revolution in Maidan, and Russia had paralysed that by occupying the Crimea and maintaining a major ethnic division between the Russian-speaking Ukrainians and the conflicts on both sides fanned up national tensions between them, and that did include Bandera fascist ones. They were quite minor, but they were there on the Ukrainian-speaking thing. They're also anti-Polish as well as anti-Russian. That revolution produced a more nationalist Ukrainian regime led by a Ukrainian-speaking oligarch, Pogorelsky, or whatever. I don't know how you pronounce these names. But anyway, that government, there was a free election in which Zelensky, a Russian-speaking Jew, swept the polls in everywhere except the most western district, which meant that there was no longer much chance of keeping Ukraine divided along ethnic divisions, which Russia was all in favour of. And it was either stamp that out now or be faced with the fact that Ukraine is joining the European Union, is becoming a modern society, is getting rid of those ethnic divisions where it's no longer an issue whether you support the Ukrainian-speaking oligarchs or the Russian-speaking oligarchs, because he was elected on opposition to both lots of oligarchs. And so that was essentially what meant that Russia had to invade, because there's no way a Russian Tsarist fascist autocracy can survive next to a democracy in Ukraine just by spouting crap like the propaganda you just mentioned. Right? You can scream about Bandera Nazis in Ukraine if you've got control of state TV in Russia, but it doesn't have much impact when both nationalities in Ukraine speak Russian, right? The Ukrainian speakers also understand Russia. The Russian speakers have got lots of family connections in Russia. If you've got a democracy in Ukraine, you can't maintain an autocratic kleptocracy in Russia. You can only rave like that when you've got full control over state TV. And they've even lost that just in the last few days, right? The control of Russian media has just collapsed. The Prigozhin's mercenary army is currently marching on Rostov-on-Don, and they're heading for some kind of internal fascist coup. But Russia's falling to bits, and that propaganda doesn't need to be spent any time on.
Can I just say quickly, as we go back down the line, just if you want to say 30, 40 seconds of closing remarks as well, just as we wrap up.
Look, in 1991, when Yeltsin abolished the Soviet Union and the different components were invited to separate, Russia was completely in control of how those borders were drawn. Yeltsin was supported by the EU and by America. They could draw those borders where they liked. They chose to draw the borders in such a way as to include a substantial Russian-speaking minority in the east of the country, for the reason that they figured that with a substantial Russian-speaking population in Ukraine would never become an enemy of Russia. Nevertheless, as Arthur said, in the election that brought Zelensky to power, he won overall. He was elected in, I thought it was every election, apparently bar one or two, he was elected. Whereas in all previous elections, there would be a Ukrainian-speaking candidate and a Russian-speaking candidate, and they were 50-50, right? And they were both corrupt, right? So the problem is suddenly this solution for keeping Ukraine friendly to Russia fell down, right? Arthur's explained what follows from that. Look, Austria, last heard of, had a fascist president. Italy has a fascist president. Probably the next election, France will have a fascist president. In Ukraine, they didn't even get a seat in parliament. And yet, apparently, the existence of these people is an excuse for a neighbouring superpower to invade them, right? Calls for abolishing NATO and we don't support NATO is abstract. We can sit here in Australia as a tiny, tiny, tiny minority and say you're for this or for that. In the other side of the world, it doesn't mean anything. The concrete question is, as Alison said, the Ukrainian people have a right to determine their own future. And the day Russia invaded Ukraine, the Scandinavian countries that have been neutral and outside NATO for 50 years, or is it longer, 70 years, suddenly decided countrywide they better get in NATO, right? So, you know, what are you doing? I think Ukraine, the war in Ukraine is a proxy war by the US, but it is also a defensive war by the Ukrainian people. They happen to coincide, you know, and you've got to deal with that, you know. NATO may be dissolved at some time in the future. The question for now is the Ukrainian people's right to determine their own future. And while they're at it, Finland and Sweden as well, and Estonia and Latvia, these other countries, and they have a right to join a military alliance that's going to defend them from Russia. Okay, that's the concrete reality. And don't sit back in Australia, safe here, and tell them that you want to abolish NATO so that Russia can invade them. I mean, that's a bit cheeky, isn't it? They've got a right to defend themselves, and if that means being part of an American-led alliance, that's their right. It makes sense. We're winding up, are we? Want me to go on to wind up?
I'll go for the general winding up.
Just let's start.
Yeah, you can have the general. This is where being first to speak is the less powerful position. Yeah, look, I harp on about solidarity. I understand what Alison is speaking, and she has a right to speak on this subject. The essence of solidarity is not just helping somebody, but doing so under their direction. So you don't ask whether or not they're for revolution before you collaborate with them in getting childcare, whatever. It's under their direction. And I'm sure you do that, Alison. I'm not criticising you in that respect. But that's the essence. And when I see left groups and tendencies fighting each other and building that one party against another, it's just a waste of time. It's so destructive. That's all. Solidarity forever.
Indeed, solidarity forever. I think the biggest legacy of the 60s is Marxist feminism, that Marxist feminism is a key political program for today. I would invite people who are here in the room to stop by our lit table. I'd highly recommend the pamphlet Socialist Feminism and the Revolutionary Party, and the political resolution from our convention last December, where you could see the methodology of how we developed our position on the Ukraine. And for people who are watching online, go to www.socialism.com and we would love to continue the conversation more with you.
I also like that slogan, or not slogan, but that comment about solidarity. Don't come to help us, but come if you know that your struggle is our struggle. And I think that's a correct position. I think it's the opposite of the TROP position about we're a transitional program. And I think TROPs in general are notorious for this practice of we can teach you how you can never win, right? We've got this theory that explains to you that you live in an unjust, oppressive system, and that no matter how hard you fight and struggle, the capitalism is going to win in the end. And that's why they're generally, and appears, I don't think Alison's group would have survived this long if it wasn't somewhat different from the traditional TROP behaviour, which I think Alison would be aware of. But the traditional TROP behaviour that resulted in the Stalinist parties, when they were Stalinist, having a very opposite line, was to lead struggles to heroic defeat. And that's certainly that's certainly not what we were trying to do in the 60s. The problem of how you lead reformist struggles and how you lead actively trying to improve the system with actively trying to overthrow it is difficult and complex, but it certainly isn't done by picking out struggles that you know you can't win and not winning them. Every struggle that we participated in the 60s, we participated in with a view to winning it, and that involves losing some of the time too. Sometimes it was quite extreme. At one point we got a motion through a student general meeting to set up a Monash People's Militia. And we didn't do that to prove that we couldn't win it, but it did get established, and so we partially won it. And it was a further victory when the student Christian movement came out with some literature saying that we were trivialising the concept of armed struggle, and we got done over by a referendum that disbanded the Monash People's Militia. But that would be one of the most extreme examples of trying to link things, but most of the time we were fighting. So, we won on Vietnam. We won on dress codes and particularly on censorship. The idea of people surrendering to politically correct language just would not occur to anyone from the 60s. We won that battle. They honestly did think. I think the Vice-Chancellor used the expression that he was there in place of our parents. And we told our parents to fuck off, and we told him to fuck off. It was a rebellious time. But the rebellions were not for the purpose of drugging it into people that they couldn't win. It was for the purpose of helping people understand that they can win, that they're capable of running the world, which they're not capable of doing yet, but they become capable of it by winning, not by losing.
Okay, and with that, thanks everyone for staying a little over time with us. Thanks to everyone online, and most of all, thanks to our panellists for us. And we're all going to go across the road to the curtain to continue the conversation.
Can you unplug me? Can you unplug the power?
Fantastic.
Can you unplug the power?
I will.
Thanks.
No, that was really good, everyone.
We were happy with it. Good.
Yeah. I hope we've got it. Me too. Well, shake your hands after.
I got you. That was fantastic. Really good. I realised also that 3 panelists is better than 4. Just 3 hours, and it's a long hour on, but with 4, there's not enough time. We actually go to everything.
Good.
That was fantastic.
Oh, I enjoyed it.
Thought you might.
Got you out of the cupboard for a bit of argument, eh?
I think we were at a surprisingly high level of agreement.